A cold wind cuts across the New Mexico desert, and it's bringing hell with it. Perilous. Chapter 1. Perdition, New Mexico. The wind, coming off the Llano Estacado, had teeth in it. Cole Hardin felt them through his coat before he cleared the last rise above Perdition, and he sat the roan for a moment on the ridge, looking down at the town while the wind pressed against him, and the roan pinned her ears and turned her head sideways to say she'd had enough of this direction. "I know," Hardin said. "I know." The town ran along the rail spur, in the flat way of towns that grew up beside tracks, rather than around something worth growing up around. A water tower. A depot with a green-painted roof going gray. The false fronts on the main street caught the last light of an October afternoon and threw it back orange and watery, and from the ridge, Hardin could count 3 saloons by the noise alone, 2 of them doing honest business, and 1 doing something else by the way the voices carried. He had $11 in his coat pocket. He had a poker debt of $60 owed to a man in Fort Stockton who collected debts through an agent named Breck, and Breck had been somewhere behind him for 4 days, closing the distance the way a bad smell closes distance. You don't see it coming, you just notice at some point that it's already there. He had a Winchester in the saddle scabbard, a Colt on his hip, and no plan for Perdition beyond finding work that paid before those $11 shrank to something that wouldn't cover a bed. He touched the roan's flank, and she started down the grade. She had a name, the roan, but it had been given to her by someone else, and she'd never answered to it, and neither of them saw the point of continuing the arrangement. She was 14 years old, and the color of dried blood, and she had a jaw like a woodcutter's block, and a mouth that had won every argument she'd ever had with a bit. A man who didn't know horses looked at her and thought ugly. A man who knew horses looked at her and thought about buying her. Hardin had bought her for $32 in Abilene 2 years ago off a drover who needed the money worse than the horse, and he'd gotten considerably the better end of that deal. Perdition, up close, bore out what Perdition from above had suggested. The main street ran 200 yards between the depot and a feed store that marked the west end of town, like a period at the end of a sentence nobody had finished writing. The hotel stood mid-block, 3 stories, the kind of building that had been painted white sometime in the Grant administration, and left to decide for itself what color it wanted to be after that. It had decided on a grayish yellow, the color of old teeth. Hardin put the roan in the livery at the east end of town. The liveryman was a heavy-set Mexican with a gray braid down his back, who ran his thumb along the roan's near shoulder and made a sound that meant he approved of what he found there. "She eat grain. She'll eat anything that holds still long enough. 4 bits a night. Hay and water included. Grain costs more." "Hay and water," Hardin said. He took his Winchester and his saddlebags and walked the length of the main street in the cold afternoon, reading the town the way he read every town. Who stood in doorways and watched him walk past, and who stood in doorways and watched him walk past and then went inside. 2 of the 3rd type, both in the 2nd saloon. The one with the piano that needed tuning, and a sign above the door that read Comstock in letters 6 inches tall. He filed this and kept walking. The hotel gave him a room on the 2nd floor, east-facing, which meant the morning light would hit it hard, but the evening would be tolerable. He washed his face in the basin, looked at the face in the mirror above it, and decided not to continue that line of inquiry. He'd been on the road for 16 days, and the road had an opinion about him that showed. He went down to the hotel dining room and ate beans and salt pork and bread, and drank 2 cups of coffee that had been made by someone with a philosophy about coffee strength that Hardin did not share. And he sat with his back to the wall and watched the room, and thought about $11.60 owed and Breck somewhere to the south closing. The poker game found him, which was how poker games in towns like this always worked. You did not look for them. You went to the saloon that looked least like trouble and ordered a drink, and within 20 minutes, someone at a corner table caught your eye and nodded at an empty chair, and the nodding was an invitation, and the empty chair was never quite as empty as it looked. The Comstock's interior ran deep and low-ceilinged, the bar along the north wall, tables in the middle, the back half in shadow past a pair of iron lamps that did their best and fell short. The piano sat against the east wall, and a man played it with the determined cheerfulness of someone who had accepted long ago that the piano would never be in tune and had decided to play through it rather than around it. The result was not music exactly, but it filled the room, which was probably the point. Hardin took a table near the front with a view of the door and ordered whiskey he did not intend to drink fast. 3 men at the corner table, already in a game. The one with his back to the room, a drummer by the loud check pattern of his coat, a sample case under his chair, the kind of salesman who sold something that came in small quantities at high prices, looked up and caught Hardin's eye and nodded at the empty chair. Right on schedule. The second man at the table was young, maybe 25, with a ranch hand's shoulders and a ranch hand's hands, thick through the knuckles, nails broken short, and a face that had not yet learned to keep what it was thinking off the front of it. He introduced himself as Obi and shook Hardin's hand with the grip of someone who had been doing physical work since he was 12 and could not turn it down to social levels. The third man said his name was Dix and left it there. He was compact, somewhere in his 40s, dark in a way that did not come from the sun. His coat was good charcoal wool, and his hands on the table were clean and still. He held his cards the way a man holds something he has stopped needing to look at. A face like a closed door. Hardin shook hands with him and sat down, and the game started, and for the first 20 minutes he paid no attention to the cards at all. He paid attention to Dix. What he saw, a man who played position, not cards, who let the drummer and Obi drive the action while he watched the edges, who folded more hands than he played, and won more hands than he folded. A man who had been doing this for a long time in a lot of different towns, and who had a quality of patience about him that Hardin associated with predators that did not need to hurry. The game was 5-card draw, 2-bit ante, no limit on raises. Hardin built his stack by the same method he used in every game. Play tight for an hour, let the table decide you're cautious, then open up when the read is right. The drummer bled chips steadily and blamed it on the cards. Obi won 2 hands on good draws and lost 4 on overconfidence, and Hardin cataloged the tells. Obi touched his left earlobe when he had a hand worth something and drummed 2 fingers on the table when he'd commit to a bluff. The drummer looked at the ceiling when he was deciding whether to call. Dix gave him nothing. In the first hour, Hardin won $40 and bought a second whiskey he did not drink any faster than the first. She came in from the back of the saloon. He heard her before he saw her. Not her voice, but the change in the room's sound, the piano player missing a note he'd been hitting all night, 2 men at the bar shifting on their stools. Then she pulled a chair to the edge of the lamp's reach, and sat in it, and crossed one leg over the other, and settled in to watch the game with the self-contained ease of a woman who went where she chose and did not spend energy explaining herself. She wore a traveling dress, the color of dark tobacco, fitted through the shoulders and waist, and a small hat pinned at an angle above dark hair she'd put up with the efficiency of someone who put their hair up to keep it out of the way rather than to present it. 32. A face built for holding its own counsel. Strong jaw, dark brows, eyes that moved across the table with the systematic attention of someone taking stock, not watching entertainment. She looked at the cards. She looked at the players. She looked at Dix. And when she looked at Dix, something in the set of her mouth changed by a degree too small to measure and too clear to miss. Hardin played the next hand badly. Not badly enough to matter, but badly enough that he caught it. He'd been watching her watch Dix and had lost the thread of the drummer's tell and bet into a flush he should have seen coming. He dropped $14 on the hand and pushed back from the table on the pretext of stretching his legs. He stood at the bar and drank a third whiskey and thought about the woman. About what she was watching for. About the way she looked at Dix. Not with any interest a woman has for a man, but with the careful attention of someone counting the seconds between a lightning strike and the thunder, calculating distance. He went back to the table. The drummer raised the opening hand, and Obi went along, and Dix folded in the first round, which Dix did often enough that it meant nothing. Hardin took the pot on 3 jacks, and a bluff that cost him more nerve than money. The drummer pushed back his chair and announced he had a train to catch, and picked up his sample case and headed for the door, and the game went to 3-handed, and 3-handed with Dix in it was a different game than 4-handed with Dix in it. He felt the shift immediately. Dix played more hands. The patience did not change, but the radius of it contracted. He'd been waiting for this configuration. Hardin tightened up and let Obi take the initiative and watched Dix and managed to stay approximately even for 20 minutes. Obi said, "Deal me out one hand. Nature calls." He pushed back and crossed toward the back of the saloon, and Hardin and Dix played heads up, and Dix won 3 of 4 hands, and the 3 he won on reads rather than cards, which meant he'd gotten a read on Hardin that Hardin had not managed to prevent. "You play a lot of poker," Dix said. He shuffled with his thumb in the bridge method, the cards snapping in a clean arc. "When I'm broke," Hardin said. "You." "When I'm working." "Working at what?" Dix smiled. It moved his mouth, but nothing above it. "This and that." Hardin looked at him across the table, and Dix looked back, and what Hardin read in the man's face was not hostility, and not friendliness, and not anything in between. It was the complete absence of investment. Dix did not care whether Hardin liked him, or feared him, or trusted him. He cared about the configuration of the table, and the chips, and whatever arrangement he'd been working toward since before Hardin sat down. And Hardin's feelings about it were not a factor. Obi came back, and the game resumed, and Hardin played the next 6 hands at a level below his ability, and let Dix take 4 of them. He was up $31 on the session, and the table now believed he'd had a lucky early run and was coming back to earth, and that belief was the thing he'd been building since he sat down. The woman had not moved. She sat in her chair beside the lamp and watched the game, and twice she looked at Hardin with a directness that he read not as interest but as assessment, the way a buyer looks at livestock before a sale. At midnight, the game broke. Obi raked his chips. He'd ended ahead by $1 and change, and was satisfied with this in the way of young men who measure success against not losing. And Dix stacked his and said goodnight to no one in particular, and Hardin put his winnings in his coat pocket alongside the $11, and made the stack feel like less than it was by distributing it across both pockets. He was halfway to the door when Obi caught his sleeve. Not a grab. A touch, 2 fingers, the kind of contact designed to be noticed by the person it was touching and no one else. Hardin stopped, looked at him. Obi's face had lost whatever uncomplicated quality it carried at the card table. He leaned close and kept his voice below the piano. "Whatever you came to Perdition for," he said, "do it by morning." He straightened up and walked away before Hardin could answer. He stood in the middle of the saloon floor and turned this over. A ranch hand with a tell and a $1.20 profit line, warning him off before midnight. Hardin started toward the door with the intention of following Obi into the street and getting the rest of it, and the door swung in before he reached it. Dix came through it. He'd been outside. Not gone, outside on the boardwalk, where a man stands when he is waiting for something to happen inside rather than leaving. He had 2 men with him that the saloon had not contained an hour ago. A wide man in a canvas coat with a face like a flatiron, and a second man, younger and thinner, who held himself with the practiced tension of someone who spends a lot of time anticipating the moment when things go sideways. Dix's pleasant expression had not changed. It was, Hardin understood now, simply the expression that sat on Dix's face the way a shutter sits on a window, not indicating anything inside, just covering it. "Mr. Hardin," Dix said. He had Hardin's name, which Hardin had not given him. "I'm going to need you to stay a moment." "For what?" "For Sheriff Poole to have a conversation with you about your card playing this evening." Dix nodded at the wide man in the canvas coat. The man pulled a deputy's badge from his coat pocket and pinned it to the canvas with the deliberate slowness of someone who wants to be sure you register the object before he explains what it means. "There have been complaints," Dix said, "about cheating. The saloon had gone to the particular quiet of a room that has been waiting for something to happen and has recognized it arriving. 12 men at the bar and the tables, none of them looking directly at Hardin, and all of them watching him." Hardin kept his hands in view and his voice at a conversational level. "Complaints from who?" "From the other players at your table." "Obi," Hardin said. "Obi won money." "From the players," Dix said again, as if Hardin had not spoken. Hardin looked at the badge on the canvas coat, at the thin man to Dix's right, whose right hand had moved to the vicinity of his hip. He looked at the 12 men at the bar, doing their careful not watching. He looked at Dix's expression, which had not changed, and understood that the expression had nothing to do with cheating accusations, and that the handcuffs the deputy was now producing from his coat pocket had been produced before the night started. He went left. Not a run, a pivot, a committed weight shift, his shoulder dropping toward the floor as his legs drove him toward the gap between the last bar stool and the back wall, because the back wall had a door he'd clocked when he came in, and doors in saloons lead somewhere even when they're unmarked, and anywhere was better than handcuffs attached to a deputy who'd pinned his badge as a prop. Behind him, the deputy's voice cracked out, and a bar stool scraped, and something glass hit the floor. Hardin hit the back door with his shoulder, and it gave, old wood, a simple latch, the kind that concedes to committed pressure, and he came through it into an alley that smelled of horses and thrown dishwater and the cold October dark. He ran. The alley ran east between the back of the Comstock and the back of a dry goods store, and it was dark enough that he navigated by feel and by the strip of sky above him, and by the principle that running in a straight line in the dark gives you better odds than running in a direction you've chosen for reasons, because reasons take time you don't have. He covered 50 feet, and the alley dog-legged, and he went with it, and his boot came down on something that rolled, a tin can, a rock, something, and he caught himself against the right-hand wall and pushed off and kept going. Behind him, the back door hit the alley wall, and voices came through it. 2 of them. One with a lamp, from the sound of it, the light bouncing orange in his peripheral vision. He came around the second dog-leg, and the alley ended. Not a street, a fence. Board fence, 6 feet. The boards close enough together that he could not read what was on the other side, and he hit it at a dead run, and got his hands on the top rail, and drove himself up, and swung one leg over, and the fence gave a sound of protest and held. And below him on the other side was a cattle pen, dark, the animals moving and shifting at the disturbance, and the smell of them coming up in a concentrated wave. He dropped into it. His boots sank 3 inches into something he chose not to examine, and he staggered and caught his balance on a fence rail, and stood in the dark of the pen with 6 or 8 steers registering his arrival, and the lamplight on the other side of the board fence throwing a strip of orange through the gaps between boards. He could not go back over the fence. He could not go through the cattle without making enough noise to bring the lamp around. The pen was 60 feet square, and he stood in the center of it, and the steers moved away from him, and the lamp pressed through the fence gaps, and a man's voice on the other side said something he could not make out, and a second voice answered it, and the lamp moved east along the fence in the direction of the gate. Then a hand came down from above and closed on his wrist. He looked up. The top of the fence was 8 feet here, higher on this side than the alley side, and sitting on it in the dark with her legs hooked over the top rail was the woman from the card table. She had both hands down, and she pulled with everything she had, and he helped with what he could, and he came up the fence boards like a man climbing a wall in a burning building, which is to say not with any elegance but with the necessary speed. And she leaned back as a counterweight, and he got a leg over, and for one moment they were both balanced on the top rail in the dark with the steers below and the lamp coming around the corner of the fence, and then they dropped together into the alley on the north side. He caught her arm and steadied her. She pulled it back. "Took you long enough," she said. "I didn't know you were up there." "I know you didn't." She brushed at her skirt and looked toward the east end of the alley, then west. "Dix has men at the livery." Hardin looked at her. She said it the way a person says something they established before they arrived, a fact in a list of facts they'd already sorted. "You know Dix," he said. "I know what Dix does and who he does it for." She started west, up the alley. "If you want to keep your horse, follow me. If you want to stand here and discuss it, I'll leave you the fence." He followed her. She moved with a directness that said she'd walked this alley before, not rushing, placing her feet with care in the dark. And she went 200 yards west before she turned south down a gap between buildings so narrow they both turned sideways to get through it, and came out on a back track that ran parallel to the main street, and smelled of coal smoke from a laundry chimney. "There's a lean-to behind the undertaker's," she said. "I put my horse there this afternoon. Your roan is there too. You took my horse from the livery." The livery man was persuadable. "When did you do that?" "Before the game ended." She kept walking. "Half an hour before." Hardin turned this over as they walked. She'd left the saloon, pulled his horse from the livery, stashed both animals behind the undertaker's, and come back and positioned herself on top of the cattle pen fence. All of this before the deputy produced his handcuffs. "You knew how the game was going to end," he said. "I knew how Dix's games end." "For everyone?" "For strangers." He let a moment go by. The coal smoke from the laundry drifted across the track, and the cold that had been in the wind all day had settled now into the ground itself, coming up through the soles of his boots. Somewhere on the main street, a door opened, and a bar of piano music escaped, and the door closed and cut it off. "Who are you?" Hardin said. She stopped at the corner of the undertaker's building and looked at him, and in the dark he could make out the line of her jaw and the set of her eyes and the expression in them, which was not unfriendly and was not friendly, and was the expression of a woman who'd been making assessments all evening and had arrived at one. "My name is Ada Reyes," she said, "and I need a man who can handle himself in the dark. Tonight I'm inclined to think that's you, but I want to have that conversation somewhere that isn't Perdition." She moved around the corner of the building. "My horse is the gray. Yours is the red, ugly one." The roan stood in the lean-to with a gray mare, and she turned her head at Hardin's approach and gave him the look she reserved for situations that had required more running than she'd signed on for. He got her bridle on, and her girth tightened and led her out and they went south out of Perdition on a track that ran beside a dry creek bed, walking, no lamps, the sky above them big and cold, and throwing enough starlight to navigate by if you trusted the ground and let the horses choose their footing. They rode south for a mile without talking. The town's lights receded behind them, and the Pecos Breaks country opened ahead, dark and enormous, the kind of landscape that reduces a man's concerns to their actual size. Hardin had $31 more than he'd had at sundown, and a cheating charge against his name in a town he'd been in for 4 hours, and a woman beside him who'd known what was going to happen before it happened, and had moved horses and climbed fences in a traveling dress and had not explained any of it yet. "All right," he said. "Tell me about Dix." She pulled the gray up to a walk, and he matched her. "Dix's name is Dixon Farr," she said. "He's not a gambler. He runs tables for a man named Calder Swick, who owns the Comstock Saloon, and about 2/3 of everything else in Perdition. The deputy, too of the town council, the feed store, the hotel, and the attorney who handles land transfers in this county. How does Swick make that pay?" "Loans," she said. "Supply contracts. Leases. He lends money at terms that look manageable until the terms change, and then the business that can't pay the new terms loses the collateral." She kept her eyes on the track ahead. "He's been doing it for 6 years, and he's very good at it. And Farr runs poker tables to find strangers who might cause him trouble. To find strangers worth removing before they become trouble. Men who can think, who can read people. Men like you." She said it without any particular weight on the compliment. "They're more dangerous to Swick than the kind who just drink and leave." Hardin rode for a moment with that. The roan's hooves on the dry ground made the only sound in a country that had gone entirely still with the cold. "You've been in Perdition a while," he said. "Knowing all this." 6 weeks. "Watching." "Waiting," she said, "for the right person to walk into Dix Farr's game." He turned to look at her profile in the dark. She rode with her back straight and her chin forward, and she did not look at him. "What happened in Perdition?" Hardin said. "To you?" She was quiet for long enough that he thought she'd decided not to answer. "Then, my husband ran a freight operation out of this town for 9 years. Wagons, a mule string, a warehouse on the rail spur. Good contracts with 3 mines in the territory, and a mail route from here to Santa Rosa." She paused. "Swick called the operating loan 8 months ago. Raphael couldn't pay the new terms on 30 days' notice. Nobody could. Swick took the wagons, the mules, the warehouse, and the contracts. And Raphael." The gray picked her way around a dry wash, and Ada let her find the line. "He rode north 8 months ago to find a lawyer in Las Vegas who could file on the loan terms. He sent me one letter from Santa Rosa saying he'd found a man who thought the interest clause was fraudulent." She stopped there. "One letter," Hardin said. "One letter. 8 months ago." The track ran ahead of them into the dark, and the stars wheeled overhead in the slow arc they'd been wheeling since before this country had a name. And Hardin sat the roan and thought about a man who rode north 8 months ago to find a lawyer and sent one letter, and after that nothing, and a woman who came to Perdition 6 weeks later and waited for the right stranger to walk into a crooked poker game. "How much?" he said. "How much what?" "You're going to offer me money. How much?" She looked at him then. In the starlight, her face held a quality he'd noticed at the card table. Not calculation exactly, but its precursor. The state just before calculation, when a person is deciding how much of what's true they can afford to put on the table. "Half of what I have," she said. "Which is the last freight payment from the Santa Rosa run, collected before Swick moved. $240. Half is $120. Hardin thought about his $11, about his $31 win, and Breck somewhere to the south who wanted 60 of it, about Obi's hand on his sleeve, and the words "do it by morning," and the fence rail under his palms in the dark, and the fact that he was now wanted for cheating in a town he'd been in long enough to drink 3 whiskeys. "What do you need?" he said. "Proof of what Swick did. Records. He keeps everything in a lockbox in the Comstock's back office. A man who can move in the dark." She left a beat of silence where she didn't say what they both understood. "Could get into that office and write down everything in the box and get out before anyone checked the lock." "That's not proof. That's notes. The notes tell me what proof to look for. And where Raphael is." She said it without drama. The last part of the sentence placed the same as any other part, and he understood that was where the whole conversation had been pointed from the beginning. He rode another minute. "I'll think about it," he said. "I know you will." They made camp in a cut above the river where the bluffs gave shelter from the wind and dry wood lay in the creek bed. She built the fire with an efficiency that said she'd been building fires in the field since before she needed his opinion about it. And they sat on opposite sides of it and drank coffee from her kit, and the night pressed down around them, cold and enormous and indifferent. He took the first watch, and she went to sleep between her saddle and her bedroll with the practiced immediacy of someone who has learned to sleep when they can and for as long as they get. He sat with the fire burning down and the Rhone ground tide in the dark behind him, and thought about a freight operation and a lockbox and $120, and a man who had ridden north 8 months ago and sent 1 letter. At some point he slept. The gray light before dawn came through the bluffs, and he came awake with it and reached for the coffee pot and found the fire cold and the gray mare gone, and Ada Rhea's saddle gone, and her bedroll gone. He sat up. On the ground beside the dead fire, weighted under a flat stone from the creek bed, a piece of paper torn from a small notebook. He held it toward the gray light to read it. She'd written an address on the south end of the main street, Perdition. A time, midnight. Below that, the lockbox combination is Raphael's birth date. March 14, 1851. Write down everything you find. Be there before me. I cannot be objective about this. You can. He turned the paper over. On the back, in letters smaller and pressed harder into the paper, as if added after she'd thought about whether to include it, "Latimer's man arrived in Perdition last night. He's asking about you at the Comstock." Hardin read this twice. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket and sat looking at the dead fire and the cold creek bed and the bluffs going gray-pink in the first light, and he turned over the sum of it. A cheating charge in a town owned by a man he'd never met, a lockbox in a back office with a combination built from a dead man's birthday, $120 he hadn't earned, a woman who'd planned 3 moves ahead of him and disappeared before he woke up. And Breck in Predition, asking about him. At the one saloon in town he absolutely could not walk back into. The Rhone had pulled her picket stake sometime in the night and moved 8 feet north toward better grass, dragging the rope. She stood with her head down and one hip cocked and opened one eye at him when he came over. "Stop me," Hardin said, "if any of this sounds like a good idea." The Rhone closed the eye. He saddled her and pointed her north toward Perdition, and the morning light came up red behind the bluffs and lay across the Pecos Breaks country in long strips of color, red and amber, and the pale gold of dry grass. And it was a beautiful morning to be riding toward trouble, and he knew better than to say so out loud. Chapter 2. What Ada Knows. Stop me if any of this sounds like a good idea. The Rhone opened one eye, decided against it, and went back to whatever horses think about when they stand still with their eyes closed. Hardin reread Ada's note, folded it into his shirt pocket, and looked north toward Perdition. Breck in town. Asking about him at the Comstock. He turned that over a few times, like a stone he wasn't sure he wanted to look under. Breck's presence had three possible meanings. Breck had tracked him here on his own, which was possible. Breck had received word from someone in Perdition, which required someone in Perdition to know Hardin was coming, which he hadn't known himself until 2 days ago. Or Breck simply happened to be moving through this territory on other business and stumbled across a name he recognized at the Comstock's bar. He saddled the roan and pointed her north. The Pecos Breaks country in the early morning had a stripped severity to it, the October light coming in low and cold over the caprock edge and throwing every rock and draw into sharp relief. The grass on the flats ran silver-gray with frost that would burn off by 8 and leave nothing behind to prove it had been there. Hawks worked the thermals above the bluffs. 2 antelope stood at the rim of a draw 200 yards off and watched him pass with the absolute stillness of animals that have concluded he is not worth running from, which he chose to take as a professional compliment. The note sat in his pocket, and the combination sat in his head. March 14, 1851. A man's birthday, committed to a lockbox. Hardin tried to arrange what he knew into something with a shape. Swick ran Perdition through debt instruments and a deputy's badge and a table gambler named Dix Farr who found independent thinkers and removed them. Rafael Reyes had run a legitimate freight operation for 9 years and made the mistake of taking Swick's operating loan. The loan terms changed, and Rafael couldn't meet them, and Swick took everything. Rafael rode north to find legal remedy and sent 1 letter from Santa Rosa, and after that, nothing, and that nothing had been sitting in Ada's chest for 8 months like a stone she couldn't set down. She'd come to Predition to find out what the nothing meant. The $120 was real money. It was enough to put distance between himself and Breck, enough to eat and stable the roan for 2 months while he found honest work, enough to retire the Fort Stockton debt with some left over. All he had to do was get into the Comstock's back office, open a lockbox with a dead man's birth date, write down what he found, and get out without Dix Farr or the deputy or Calder Swick's 2/3 of Perdition catching him at it. And he couldn't ride south without going through Perdition, or around it on 100 miles of bad country, because Ada had told him that, and Ada, he was beginning to understand, did not tell him things that weren't true. He rode north. He came into Perdition from the east, off the Caprock Trail that dropped into the dry creek bed south of the cattle pens, and tied the roan in the same creek bed willows where Ada had stashed the horses the night before. He changed his coat in the bluffs before he rode in, reversed the brown one, which was brown on both sides, a modification he'd made in Amarillo for reasons that had nothing to do with the current situation and everything to do with his line of work. He pulled his hat brim down and walked up through the pens and onto the back track at mid-morning when the town had enough foot traffic that one more man on foot drew nothing. He needed 3 things before midnight: to find the address on Ada's note and confirm the layout, to locate Breck and understand his intentions, and to eat something, because he'd had coffee and gone to sleep and ridden 7 miles on an empty stomach, and his judgment got unreliable when his judgment didn't get fed. The hotel dining room served him eggs and bread, and more of the coal-black coffee that he'd come to terms with, and he ate at a table near the window where he could see the main street and the entrance to the Comstock. A woman ran the dining room, 40, red-faced, built for work, and she topped up his coffee without being asked, and he revised his opinion of the hotel upward by 1 notch. "You the one that cheated at Dix Farr's table last night," she said. She said it the way she topped up the coffee, as a routine service. "Somebody say, I did." "Dix Farr said you did." "Dix Farr says whatever gets the deputy moving." She set the pot down. "You want more bread?" "Please." She brought it. Deputy Poole's been in here twice this morning, asking after a man on a red horse. I told him I hadn't seen one. Hardin looked up at her. She had a face built for keeping its own counsel. The lines around her eyes, the kind that come from years of watching other people's business go sideways in her dining room. Why'd you do that? Because Dick's Farr's been running that table for 3 years, and nobody who ever sat down at it cheated, she said. They don't need to. They're usually better than the other players. Dick's just finds a reason afterward. She picked up the pot. He's particular about the reason being cheating, because cheating's a civic matter, and the deputy can hold you without a territorial charge. Keeps it local. You know a lot about how it works. Half the businesses on this street know how it works. She moved to the next table. That's why they're still open. Knowing and doing something about it are 2 different kinds of trouble. He left a $1 tip on the table and went to find the address from Ada's note. The building sat at the south end of the main street, where the street ran out into a dirt track that led to the rail spur. Adobe construction, 1 story, 2 windows on the street side with their shutters closed. A door in the middle painted the same dark green as the depot roof, and above the door nothing. No sign, no shingle, no indication of purpose. Buildings without signs in cattle towns served one of 3 purposes: storage, private meetings, or the kind of business that ran better without advertising. Hardin walked past it on the street side without slowing. Turned down the alley at the corner, walked behind it. The back wall had a single door, unpainted wood, a hasp and padlock on the outside. The padlock was a 4-lever Scandinavian model, heavier than it needed to be for a back alley door, which told him the contents were worth protecting, and that Swick knew the difference between a lock that deterred and one that stopped. He'd need a proper pick for that one, or he'd need the front door. The front door, with its painted green and its Main Street exposure, was its own problem. He walked the alley to its end and came back around to the street. Across from the building, angled in his chair on the boardwalk in front of a leather goods shop, a man sat reading a newspaper in the cold October sun with his hat tipped back and his boots crossed at the ankle and his coat open at the front. He was perhaps 40, medium build, brown hair going gray at the temples. His face had a pleasant, forgettable quality, the kind of face that registers as nothing specific and therefore remembers itself in nobody's mind after the fact. He turned a page of the newspaper without looking up. Hardin recognized him, the way you recognize a smell before you identify the source. He walked past the leather goods shop. The man with the newspaper did not acknowledge him. Hardin went to the end of the block, crossed the street, came back on the opposite side. He bought a sack of tobacco from the dry goods store next to the hotel and stood in the doorway building a cigarette and watching the man with the newspaper. The newspaper had not turned a page in 4 minutes. He crossed back. "Breck," he said. The man with the newspaper lowered it 2 inches and looked at Hardin over the top edge with mild brown eyes that held the professional patience of a man who has been waiting for something he knew was coming and sees no reason to perform surprise about its arrival. Cole Hardin. Breck folded the newspaper precisely along its original crease and set it on his knee. "You look like you slept outside." "I did." "How's the roan?" "Fine." "Good horse." Breck uncrossed his boots and set them flat on the boardwalk. "Sit down. I'm not going to make this dramatic." Hardin took the other chair. It was an inch lower than Breck's, which was probably intentional. "Here's where I am," Breck said. He had a voice built for small rooms and private conversations, low and clear, designed to travel no further than the person it was aimed at. "Latimer wants his $60, and he sent me to collect it. I've been behind you for 5 days. You came to Perdition instead of going around it or through it, which tells me you're either out of money or into something. He looked at the building across the street. The way you just walked past that address twice and then came back suggests the second one. What address? Breck smiled. It was a genuine smile, which was somehow more unsettling than a false one. The one the woman left in her note. Hardin studied him. You read the note. I found your camp before dawn. You were asleep. She was already gone. He opened his coat to show his empty hands, a gesture of inventory. I don't steal coal. I read what was lying on the ground, and I put the rock back. You could have woken me. I could have. Then we'd have had this conversation in a creek bed in the dark, and I'd rather have it in a chair in the sun. He picked up the newspaper. Who is she? None of your business. Probably not. But she's involved with Calder Swick's operations somehow, which makes you involved, which makes $60 a secondary concern for the moment. Hardin looked at him. You know Swick? I know of Swick. Breck turned the newspaper over on his knee. He's a name that comes up in certain kinds of conversations in this territory. Debt instruments, land transfers that don't go the way the original parties intended. I move in those circles professionally. Does Latimer have business with him? Latimer has business with everyone who owes money, Breck said. Swick owes nobody. He's on the collecting end. Different animal. He refolded the newspaper. What's in the building? I don't know yet. What's in the lockbox in the building? Hardin looked across the street at the green door and the closed shutters and thought about a dead man's birthday and a woman who'd climbed a cattle pen fence in a traveling dress to pull a stranger over it. Proof that Swick ran a man off his freight operation through fraudulent loan terms, he said. And maybe something about where that man ended up. Breck absorbed this the way he absorbed everything, without visible reaction, filing it. The woman's the wife. Yes. A freight wagon rolled down the main street between them and the building, the driver up top in a canvas coat, the mules pulling with the grim efficiency of animals that have given up expecting anything to improve. Breck watched it pass. The lockbox, Breck said. You plan to go in tonight. That's what I'm thinking about. The front door or the back? The back locks a 4-lever Scandinavian. So the front. So the front. Breck nodded once, a man updating a set of figures. Give me the 60 by morning, and I'll stay out of your way tonight. I don't have 60. Have it by morning. The job doesn't pay until it's done. Breck looked at him across the 2 chairs in the October sun, and Hardin looked back, and the space between them held the particular arithmetic of 2 men who each understand the other's position and are deciding how much of their own to concede. A woman came out of the leather goods shop behind them with a package wrapped in brown paper and stepped around them without comment. Have it by morning, Breck said again. Whatever that requires. He picked up the newspaper and opened it back to where he'd been. Dix Farr eats his supper at the Comstock at 6 o'clock. Deputy Poole makes his rounds at 8, 10, and midnight. There's a half-hour gap between his 10 o'clock pass and when he stops at the Comstock for his nightcap. Hardin stood. How do you know that? Because I've been sitting in this chair since 7 this morning, Breck said, and I read the newspaper very slowly. He spent the afternoon the way he spent afternoons before work. He didn't fully know the shape of. Moving, eating, not drinking, keeping off the main street, watching the building from 3 different angles at 3 different times, and cataloging who went in, who came out, how long the intervals ran between. 2 men went in through the green door at 2 in the afternoon, businessmen from their coats and their carrying of papers. They came out at 3, not carrying papers, which meant they'd left them, or the meeting had not gone the way they'd brought papers to suggest it would go. A young man Hardin didn't recognize unlocked the front door with a key at 4:30 and went in, and came out again at 5 with a coal oil lamp he carried toward the Comstock. The building was Swick's office as much as anything then, and the lamp meant the Comstock's interior. Made sense. The man who owned a saloon and a freight warehouse and 2/3 of a cattle town's commerce did his paperwork somewhere quieter than the saloon floor. He found Ada at 6 o'clock. She found him, more precisely. He was buying a second sack of tobacco at the dry goods store when she appeared beside him at the counter and picked up a spool of thread and held it toward the lamp to check the color and said without looking at him, "The back lock. I have a key." "Since when?" "Since 3 weeks ago. I paid the locksmith's apprentice $4 to copy it." She put the thread back. "Midnight. I'll meet you at the back door. You said in the note I should be there before you. You should be inside before I arrive. There's a difference." She moved toward the door. "There's a man watching the building." "Breck," Hardin said. "He works for a man I owe money to. He's not connected to Swick." She turned at the door and looked at him with the expression she'd worn in the saloon when she clocked Dick's Farr's tells, taking stock, not expressing anything about what she found. "Is he a problem?" "He's a complication." "Are you going to handle it?" "Yes." She held his eye for 2 seconds, then went out the door into the street. He watched her walk south toward the rail spur, not hurrying, a woman with thread she didn't buy and a key she'd had for 3 weeks. He ate supper at the hotel dining room again. The red-faced woman brought him beef stew without being asked, and refilled his coffee the same way and said nothing. And he sat with his back to the wall and thought about Breck. Breck was not the enemy. He was a professional obligation, which was different. He collected debts because it paid better than most work and required a specific set of skills that Breck had spent years developing. Patience, the ability to read a situation fast, and the kind of social ease that made a man seem unthreatening right up until he needed to seem otherwise. He'd worked for Latimer for 6 years, and Hardin had dealt with him twice before on amounts smaller than $60, and both times they'd arrived at accommodations that suited neither of them completely, which was how accommodations work. He could bring Breck in. Not as an ally. Breck's alliance ran to whoever was paying him, and tonight that was Latimer, but as a man who had demonstrated, by sitting in a boardwalk chair all morning reading a slow newspaper, that he already knew the layout and the timing, and had no immediate interest in making Hardin's night worse than it needed to be. A man like that, positioned correctly, was useful. The question was whether Breck's version of useful ran in the same direction as Hardin's needs, and that depended on what Breck wanted beyond $60, which Hardin suspected was more than $60. He left the hotel at 9 and found Breck at the far end of the rail platform, sitting on a baggage cart with his coat buttoned against the cold and a cup of coffee from somewhere, watching the train that had come in at 8:15 and was loading freight in no particular hurry. "You're still here," Hardin said. "The next southbound doesn't leave until morning. You could ride." "I could." Breck drank his coffee. "I don't enjoy night riding on strange ground. I'm getting old." Hardin leaned against the depot wall beside the cart. The freight crew moved along the platform behind them, loading crates with the grunting, unhurried efficiency of men doing piecework at the end of a long day. A lantern swung from a post and threw moving shadows across the platform boards. "The woman has a key to the back door," Hardin said. "That changes the math. The gap between the deputy's 10 o'clock and his Comstock nightcap, how reliable is it? 3 times in the last 12 hours it ran 32, 34, 30 minutes. He stops at the feed store both times, checks the lock on the door, Takes him about 4 minutes. Then he cuts through the alley between the Comstock and the Undertaker's, comes out at the north end, and goes in the saloon's front door. Breck set the coffee cup on the cart. That alley puts him past the back of the building you want at approximately 10:20. So before 10:15 or after 10:50. After is better. He's drinking by then. Hardin looked at the platform. A crate went up on the freight car with a thud, and someone swore and someone else laughed. What do you want, Breck? $60. Beyond that. Breck considered the freight operation on the platform. There's a deputy U.S. Marshal in Las Vegas, New Mexico, named Cord Villanueva. He's been building a case for 2 years on a territorial judge named Morrow, who's been taking money to rule in certain people's favor on land and debt disputes. He kept his eyes on the freight crew. Swick's name has come up twice in connection with Morrow. If what's in that lockbox connects Swick to Morrow directly, Villanueva would be very interested in seeing it. Hardin turned this over. You work for Villanueva. I've done work for Villanueva. It's not a permanent arrangement. More like, Breck picked up the coffee cup again, found it empty, put it back. We have interests that coincide from time to time. So you tracked me here for Latimer's $60, and you happen to know about Villanueva's Morrow investigation. I tracked you here for Latimer's $60, Breck said. The rest of it, I figured out when I read the woman's note, and spent a morning on a boardwalk chair. He looked at Hardin. You think I'm running a game on you, aren't you? I'm a debt collector who reads slow newspapers, Breck said. I'm telling you that if what you pull out of that lockbox is what I think it is, there's a federal marshal in Las Vegas who wants it badly enough that I can probably convert Latimer's 60 into a letter of introduction worth considerably more. To me, professionally. He stood up from the baggage cart, a man whose back had been on a hard surface long enough. You get me what's in the box. I get Villanueva to move. Everybody ends up somewhere better than where they started. Except Swick. Except Swick, Breck agreed. He didn't sound troubled by this. Hardin straightened off the depot wall. The freight crew finished the last crate, and the platform emptied, and the lantern on the post swung in the cold air off the brake's country, throwing its light in a slow arc. In an hour and a half, he'd be at the back door of a building that held whatever it held, and a woman with a key would arrive after him, and a debt collector with an interest in federal investigations would be somewhere on this platform watching the timing. Don't come near the building, Hardin said. Not while we're inside. I'll be on the platform, Breck said. I can see the building's south wall from here. If Poole deviates from his pattern, you'll hear the train whistle. Breck nodded toward the engine sitting on the spur. The engineer and his fireman had gone somewhere for the night, but the engine itself sat there on the tracks, banked, waiting for morning with the patience of machines that have no opinion about what they wait for. I'll get on it, and pull the whistle cord and fall off the other side. Nobody in Perdition will think twice about a train whistle at night. Hardin looked at him. It's not complicated, Breck said. I'm not a complicated person. You know how to drive that engine? No. I just need the whistle cord. Hardin almost said something, and decided against it. He left Breck on the platform, and went to find a place to sit in the dark and wait for 10:50. The Comstock ran full until midnight on weeknights, which meant the south end of the main street had enough foot traffic to make a man on foot unremarkable for another hour. Hardin went to the back track at 10:45, through the same gap between buildings he'd used the night before, and came up the alley behind the building from the north end, moving along the wall. The night had gone colder. The frost that had burned off by 8 that morning had come back with reinforcements, and his breath made small clouds that he let go as low as he could manage. The alley held the residual smell of horses and coal smoke, and the particular cold intensified sharpness of adobe plaster that's been there since before anyone thought about recording when. Ada stood at the back door. She changed clothes, canvas trousers, a dark work shirt, her hair pinned close under a flat cap that had seen better years. She held a key in her right hand, and a small folding knife in her left, which she put away when she saw him. "Deputy passed at 10:18, she said. "I watched from the north end." "Good." She slid the key into the padlock. It turned on the second try, a copied key never seated as cleanly as the original, and the hasp swung free, and she pulled the door open and they went in. The back room of the building was storage, wooden shelving along 3 walls, ledger books stacked in runs by year, crates of goods that Swick had taken in lieu of loan payments from businesses that couldn't make the new terms. A side of cured beef hung from a hook. 2 saddles on sawhorses, good ones. A Mexican blanket folded on a crate, beside a clock that had stopped at 11:40, and nobody had bothered to restart. Ada moved through it without a lamp, by feel and by the strip of moonlight coming through the single high window. She knew the room. She'd been here before, Hardin understood. Not inside, but she'd looked through that window at some point, counted the shelves, mapped the layout. He followed her through a door in the interior wall into the front office. The front office had a desk, 2 chairs, a tall cabinet against the north wall with its doors shut, and a lamp on the desk that they left unlit. Moonlight came in at the front shutters in thin bars and gave them enough to work by if they stayed close to the desk. Ada went to the desk drawer on the right side and pulled it open. Her hands moved through the contents by touch, papers, an inkwell, a pen tray, something metal at the back. She set the lockbox on the desk surface. It was iron, 8 inches by 5, with a combination dial on the front face. Hardin took it and held it in the moonlight and turned the dial. 4 numbers, Ada had written. He ran the sequence from the note, right to 3, left past 3 to 1, right to 4, left to 5, 1. The mechanism gave a sound like a swallowed click, and he felt the body of the box shift against the lid, and he lifted it. Ada's hand came down on his wrist. He stopped. She'd heard something he hadn't. He set the box down, and they both stood still, and the building made the small sounds that buildings make when the temperature drops. A tick from the adobe, a creak from the shelving in the back room, and under those sounds from the alley behind the building, footsteps. One person. Slow, deliberate. Stopping at the back door. The door had not closed fully when they came through it. He checked. He always checked, and left it off the latch, pushed to but not seated, so it didn't rattle in the wind, but open from outside without a key. The copied key went to Ada, and not to him, which meant if they needed to leave through the front, Ada went first with the key, and he went last and locked the front door behind him. That was the arrangement they hadn't discussed and both understood. The footsteps stopped at the door. A long silence. Long enough that Hardin ran the options. Pool a half-hour early, one of Swick's men on a routine check, a drunk looking for the alley, and arrived at a 4th option just as the back door pushed open and a voice came through the dark of the back room, low and unhurried. "I found a problem." Breck. Ada's hand tightened on Hardin's wrist, and he put his other hand over hers once and she let go. He moved to the connecting doorway. "What problem?" "Dix Farr left the Comstock 20 minutes ago, and he didn't go home. He went to the Comstock's back office, which is different from this building's back office, and he came out with 2 men I haven't seen before, and they split up, one going north, one going south." Breck moved through the storage room by feel, knowing where the shelves were because he'd been through that window too, Hardin understood, at some point in his slow newspaper morning. "The one going south is going to come up this alley in approximately 4 minutes. How do you know it's 4 minutes? Because I watched him turn down the cross street, and I know how long that block takes to walk. Breck arrived at the connecting doorway and stopped there, a shape in the dark. Did you get it open? Just now. Then read fast. Ada already had the box. She turned the desk chair toward the moonlight bars from the shutters, and she sat in it with the box on her lap and her hands inside it, reading by touch and by the thin silver light that lay across the desk surface in angled strips. Hardin stood at the connecting doorway and listened to the alley and watched her hands. She pulled out papers and sorted them by feel into 2 piles on the desk, lifted something from the box that caught the moonlight, metal, small, circular, set it down, reached back in, and her hands stopped moving. He watched her face. She held something in her hands that he couldn't see clearly in the moonlight bars, and she sat very still for 3 seconds, 4, 5. And her face did the thing that faces do when a person confirms something they already knew and had hoped they were wrong about. Not a collapse. A settling. The way a building settles when the last beam goes in, and the structure accepts its own weight. There's a letter, she said. Her voice stayed level. From Swick. Addressed to someone called G. Morrow. Read it. She read it in the moonlight, moving the paper in the thin bars to catch each line. Hardin watched the alley through the back room's single high window, and the alley held nothing but cold air and the residual scent of someone who had walked through it recently, coal oil on his coat, moving south. He writes about a loose end, Ada said. Resolved north of the Canadian River. She set the letter on the desk. Swick used those words. Resolved. Like a business matter. The back door swung open. Not Breck. Breck was already inside. Not the wind. The door opened with the deliberate push of a hand that knew what it was opening and why. And Hardin dropped from the doorway into the back room in the same motion he drew the Colt. And the man coming through the door had a lamp in one hand that he'd had the sense to keep low. And the lamp threw his face into relief from below, and the face was one Hardin hadn't seen before, which meant one of Dick Farr's 2 men had taken less than 4 minutes to cover the block. The man saw Hardin, and the lamp came up by reflex, and the light hit the shelves, and the cured beef and the 2 saddles on sawhorses and Hardin's Colt centered on the man's chest, and the man stood in the doorway holding the lamp and held very still. Set it on the floor, Hardin said. Don't put it down. Set it. On the floor. The man set the lamp on the floor. The light pooled across the boards and threw everything above knee height into confusion. Shout, move your hand toward your belt or step back through that door, Hardin said, and we'll have a serious disagreement about whether you go home tonight. The man's eyes moved to the lamp on the floor, then back to the Colt. He'd been sent to check the building, not to fight a man with a gun already out, and the calculus of that showed plainly across his face. How many with Dix? Hardin said. The man pressed his mouth together. I'll ask once more. 3, the man said. Including me. Where are the other 2? Moss went north end of the alley. Dick stayed at the Comstock. Behind Hardin, from the front office, Ada's voice came through the doorway. I have what I need. Breck's voice followed it. The north end of the alley is going to have company in about 2 minutes. The man in the doorway heard Breck's voice, and his eyes went wide by a fraction. 2 men where he'd expected 1, maybe 1, changed the numbers. He shifted his weight back toward the open door. Don't, Hardin said. He stopped. Hardin crossed the room in 4 strides and hit the man in the side of the head with the flat of his left hand, hard enough to ring his ears, and sit him down on the floor against the shelving, and went past him through the back door into the alley at a run with Ada behind him and Breck behind her. And the alley ran north toward the cross street where the man named Moss was going to emerge from one end while they ran toward the other. and Hardin counted the steps and the seconds and the distance between them and the cross street and made the turn south instead. South. Away from Moss. Away from the Comstock. Toward the rail spur, and the dry creek bed and the roan in the willows. Ada ran beside him with her cap pulled down and her arms driving, and she ran the way she did everything, committed no wasted motion, not glancing back. Breck behind them made more noise than either of them but kept pace. The alley gave onto the cross track, and they went across it without stopping, and into the gap between buildings that put them on the back track parallel to the main street. And Hardin let the pace come down to a fast walk, because running in the dark on a back track in a strange town was how you went face first into a fence post. He'd learned that the hard way, in a different town on a different night with a different debt, and some lessons you only needed once. Behind them, from the alley they'd left, a man's voice called out, not a shout, a controlled call, Moss finding his partner on the floor of the storage room. A lamp came on in the building's back window. Front letter first, Ada said between steady breaths. The lockbox had 2 layers. I read both. Tell me when we're moving, Hardin said. They reached the creek bed and the willows, and Hardin had the roan untied and saddled in 4 minutes, with Ada holding the bridle, and Breck watching the track behind them with his own horse, brought up from wherever he'd stabled it, which turned out to be 20 yards further down the creek bed, which meant Breck had been more prepared for this outcome than he'd let on. Where? Breck said. North, Ada said. She mounted the gray, and held it while it turned a circle. I know a camp, above the river. 3 miles. She put the gray north at a canter, and Hardin followed, and Breck came up alongside him. And behind them Perdition's lights burned orange in the cold air, and the Comstock's piano sent its tuneless music out across the flat, and nobody who heard it would think anything about 3 riders moving north in the dark. The letter about the loose end, resolved, north of the Canadian River sat inside Ada's coat, and the object from the second layer of the lockbox sat there too, and Hardin hadn't seen it clearly in the moonlight, and hadn't asked yet. He'd ask when they stopped. He didn't want to ask while they were moving, because he'd seen her face when her hands stopped moving inside the box. And he understood enough about what that expression meant to know it deserved a fire, and a stopped horse, and something other than the sound of hooves on cold ground. Chapter 3. There were 2 layers, Ada said. She sat on a rock above the river with her knees together, and her elbows on them, and her hands clasped in front of her, and she looked at the fire Breck had built rather than at either of them. The fire was small, the kind a man builds when he's been in country where you don't advertise, and it threw just enough light to read faces by, if you knew what you were reading. Hardin let her take her time. Breck found a log, and sat on it, and produced a pipe from his coat, and packed it without lighting it, which was Breck's version of making himself unobtrusive. On top, she said, loan documents. The original note for the freight operation. $80 at 9% on a 12-month term, which was what Raphael signed. She pulled the papers from inside her coat and held them toward the firelight. This version has the interest at 14% and a collateral clause that covers all operating assets including rolling stock. That clause is in different ink than the rest of the document. Slightly lighter. Raphael's signature is on the bottom next to Swick's, and it's Raphael's signature, but the date beside it has been changed. The 9 has been written over. You can see the original number underneath if you tilt it right. Hardin took the document and tilted it toward the fire. The date showed it, the overwritten 9, the ghost of a different digit beneath it. Someone patient and careful, working in good light with a steady hand. The kind of forgery that survived a casual look and fell apart under a close one. The second layer, Ada said. She reached back into her coat and brought out 2 things. The first was a folded letter, a single sheet which she set on her knee. The second she held in her closed fist for a moment, then opened her hand. A man's ring. Gold, plain band, worn thin on the bottom where the metal had rubbed against 11 years of work. Hardin had seen rings like it on the hands of men who'd worn them so long they'd stopped registering the weight. "Raphael never took it off," she said. Her voice carried the same register it had carried all night, even controlled, the voice of a woman who had decided some time before tonight that she would not let grief do her thinking for her. "He said it was bad luck to take it off. I told him that was superstition. He said maybe so." She closed her hand around the ring again. "The ring being in that box means he didn't give it up on his own." The fire popped once and a spark rose and died. "The letter," Hardin said. She picked it up. From Swick. Addressed to G. Morrow, Santa Fe. No street or office, just the name and the city. She read from it. "The situation north of the Canadian has been resolved as discussed. There will be no further complications from that quarter. The property transfers you inquired about are proceeding under the adjusted documentation." She refolded it. Swick signed it. "There's a date. 3 months after Raphael rode north." Breck lit his pipe. The match flared and went out, and the pipe bowl glowed orange. He blew a stream of smoke into the air above the fire and said, "Resolved north of the Canadian." "Yes. That's where the Canadian River breaks country runs into the Llano," Breck said. "Bad ground up there. Draws and arroyos. A man could ride into that country and not ride out, and it might be spring before anyone found him." Ada turned the ring in her fingers. She'd heard this. She'd known it before Breck said it. She was not looking for confirmation of what she knew. She was looking for the thing that came after knowing it, which was direction. "Morrow," Hardin said. "You know the name." "Grantham Morrow." She put the ring in her coat pocket and held it there with her hand. "Territorial District Court, Santa Fe. He handles land disputes, contract enforcement, debt claims." She looked at Hardin across the fire. "Every complaint about Swick's loan practices that's been filed in the last 4 years has gone through Morrow's court. Every one of them has been dismissed." "How do you know that?" "Because Raphael spent 2 months before he rode north writing letters and pulling court records. He sent me copies." She pulled her hand from her pocket. "I have them. I've had them for 8 months." Breck took the pipe from his mouth. "You came to Perdition with the court records." "I came to Perdition with the court records. My husband's correspondence with 3 other freight operators who'd lost businesses to Swick, and the name of a lawyer in Las Vegas who thought the interest clause in our original loan note was illegal under territorial statute." She looked at Breck steadily. "What I didn't have was the altered loan document with Raphael's signature, and the letter connecting Swick to Morrow directly. Those were in the box." "And the ring," Hardin said. "And the ring." Breck and Hardin looked at each other across the fire over Ada's head. Breck's expression was the same expression it always was, which was to say, it communicated nothing and absorbed everything. But his pipe had gone out, and he hadn't relit it. "Swick has a judge," Hardin said. "In the territory's only district court for land and debt claims," Breck said. "Which means the standard legal routes." "Are Swick's," Ada said. "Yes. I knew that before tonight. Tonight, I have the document that proves the mechanism." "Proves it to who?" Hardin said. "You can't take it to a territorial court." Breck relit the pipe. He took his time about it, shielding the match with his cupped hand, drawing until the bowl caught. "Villanueva," he said. "Who?" Ada said. Hardin answered for him. "A deputy U.S. Marshal in Las Vegas." Breck says he's been building a case on Morrow for 2 years. Federal jurisdiction. Morrow can't touch it. Ada looked at Breck. Is that true? There are things I exaggerate for professional reasons, Breck said. That's not one of them. She turned it over. Hardin could see her doing it. Not the turning over of a woman who doubted, but of one who was examining each joint in the structure to confirm it bore weight. Villanueva gets the letter, and the altered document and the ring. Villanueva gets those and your court records, and your husband's correspondence, Breck said. And he has a federal fraud and conspiracy case against Swick, and a judicial corruption case against Morrow that he's been trying to build from the outside for 2 years. You hand him the inside, and he moves. He moves on Swick, Ada said. What about Raphael? The fire burned. Somewhere down in the river breaks an owl called once and went quiet, and the silence after it sat over the camp for a moment before the ordinary sounds of the night came back. The letter says resolved, Breck said carefully. It doesn't say dead. I know what it says. There's country north of the Canadian where a man could be held as easily as he could be buried, Breck said. If Swick needed leverage, and Raphael was worth more alive. He's been 8 months. I know. She sat with the fire and didn't say anything else, and neither did they, because some accounting has to be done in the open before it can be put away, and this was that kind. They slept 2 hours and rode south before first light, Ada leading, Breck hanging back a quarter-mile in the way of a man who understood when company needed reducing. The Pecos Breaks country at 4 in the morning had a quality of absolute desertion to it, the stars hard and close overhead, the ground pale below them, everything between the two stripped to outline and shadow. Hardin's roan moved in the dark with her ears working, reading the ground ahead, and he let her pick the pace. He thought about the letter. Resolved. A man's ring in a lockbox. 8 months. Ada rode without looking back. Her spine stayed straight, and her chin stayed level, and her hands on the gray's reins stayed loose. And Hardin had seen enough people carry bad news on horseback to know that she'd arrived at the place past the first shock of it, and was now in the country where a person decides what to do next. That country was colder and cleaner than the shock. People were more useful there. She stopped her horse at the junction where the north track hit the bench road, and waited for him to come up beside her. The freight warehouse, she said. What about it? Swick kept the wagons there after he took the operation. He's using the warehouse for storage now, goods he's collected from businesses that defaulted. She turned the gray south onto the bench road. There's a room in the back. An office. Raphael used it to keep the freight manifests and the operational records. His personal ledger should still be there. You think Swick left it? Swick took what had value. A freight ledger in a man's handwriting has no value to Swick. But it has value to me. It's 8 years of Raphael's roots, his clients, the amounts owed by the businesses that were his customers before Swick took his contracts. She didn't slow the gray. Those clients still owe that money. Under Swick's operation, they're paying it to Swick. Under a recovered operation, they'd pay it to me. Hardin rode with that. You want the business back. I want what belongs to the estate, she said. The ledger establishes the accounts receivable. The altered loan document establishes the fraud. Villanueva moves on Swick. The fraud voids the seizure, and the freight operation reverts. That's a lot of moving parts. Raphael spent 9 years building those parts, she said. I'm not leaving them for Swick to keep. Breck came up behind them. The warehouse, he said. He'd heard enough of it. When? Tonight, Ada said. Swick doesn't know what we took from the box. He knows someone was in the building. His man on the floor told him that, but the box was relocked and he has no way to know what we read. He'll know by morning, Hardin said. Then we go tonight. They spent the day in an arroyo 6 miles north of Perdition, in a cut deep enough to shelter the horses from the wind and conceal a fire at the bottom. Ada slept for 3 hours in the early morning with her hat over her face, and woke up looking no different than she had before, which Hardin found either admirable or unsettling, and settled on both. Breck read his newspaper, which he appeared to carry in an inside pocket as a matter of principle. Hardin cleaned the Colt and checked the Winchester and thought about freight warehouses. He'd been in 2 in his life. One in Abilene that he'd gone into under better circumstances than these and come out of under worse. One in Tascosa that he'd gone into and out of without incident and was the exception. Freight warehouses were long and low and subdivided by use, docking bay at one end, main storage in the middle, office at the back. And the subdivision meant a man moving through one moved through choke points where any other man positioned correctly had the advantage. You didn't want to be moving through a freight warehouse if someone inside it knew you were coming. Dick's Farr will know to watch the warehouse, he said. Ada looked up from the fire. I know. After last night, he knows someone's working against Swick from inside the town. He's going to put men in the places that matter. I know that too. Then walk me through why we go anyway. She poured coffee from the pot into her cup and held it in both hands. Because the ledger is the only record of the freight operations accounts receivable that exists outside of Swick's own books. If Swick finds it before we get to it, or destroys it because he's worried about what we took from the lockbox, that's the end of the legal basis for recovering the business. She drank the coffee. And because I've been planning this for 6 weeks, and I'm not going to stop one night short of having everything. Hardin looked at her, and she looked back at him, and there was nothing complicated in the exchange. She'd told him her reasons. They were good ones. The risk was real, and the reasons outweighed it in her accounting, and she'd laid both sides of the ledger out, and he could make his own calculation. He thought about the $120. He thought about the ring in her coat pocket. He thought about a man who rode north 8 months ago and never came home. Breck, he said. Breck lowered the newspaper. I'm in, he said before Hardin finished the sentence. But I want the 60 waived, not deferred. That's between you and Latimer. If Villanueva moves on Swick, and this ends up in federal court, I'll have done enough for Villanueva's office that Latimer will write off the 60 for the connection. He folded the newspaper. That's my calculation. You don't need to understand it, just know I'm in. They went into Perdition at dusk, Breck first and alone by 20 minutes, Ada second by the south track, Hardin last by the creek bed route he'd been using since the night before. The town had a different texture at dusk than it did at night, the lamps coming on one by one, the supper hour drawing people off the street, the particular lull between the working day and the drinking night when Perdition was briefly neither one thing nor the other. Hardin went to the hotel dining room. The red-faced woman set a plate in front of him without being asked, and he ate quickly, watching the window. No sign of Dick's Farr on the main street. 2 of the deputy's regular stops were shops that closed at sundown, which compressed his rounds into a smaller geography after dark. Breck had mapped it, and Hardin trusted the mapping. He went to the warehouse at 8 o'clock. The rail spur ran behind the main street, and the warehouse sat beside it, a long adobe structure with a tin roof that pinged and popped as the evening temperature dropped. Loading doors on the spur side, a personnel door on the street side with a padlock that matched the one on Swick's back office. Ada had no copy of this one. Hardin stood in the shadow of the depot platform overhang and looked at the warehouse for 5 minutes, and saw no light inside and no movement at either entrance. He crossed to the personnel door and went to work on the padlock with the bent steel strip from his coat pocket. This one was a 5-lever, heavier than the other buildings, and it took him 4 minutes of careful work in the dark before the levers aligned and the shackle swung free. He pulled the door and went in and pulled it closed behind him. The warehouse interior ran 80 feet from the street end to the spur end and smelled of axle grease, rope hemp, old timber, and the particular compound odor of goods stored in quantity. Dry goods, leather, cured meat, the faint sweetness of grain. Tall shelving along both walls, loaded with crates and sacking and equipment. The remnants of the freight operation ran down the center. 2 wagons with their tongues up, a row of harness hanging from iron hooks, a mule collar split at the crown that someone had kept meaning to repair. Swick's acquisitions shared the space with what he'd acquired them from, which had a kind of efficiency to it, and no decency at all. The office sat at the back behind a plank door with a latch, no lock. Hardin pushed it open and went in. Small room, a desk, a chair, a shelf above the desk with a row of ledger books standing upright between 2 bricks. Manifests and route maps pinned to the wall. A tin cup on the desk, still holding a pen that had dried out months ago. Rafael Reyes had left this office in a hurry 8 months ago, riding north, and nothing in it had been moved since. Hardin took the lamp from his coat, a small folding railroad lamp, ADIS that threw a focused beam no wider than a hand, and turned it on the shelf. The ledger books ran by year on their spines: 1879, 1880, 1881, 1882, 1883. 5 years of freight routes and billing, and the names of every business that had sent goods on Rafael Reyes's wagons. He took the 2 most recent and set them on the desk. He heard the front door of the warehouse open. Not the personnel door he'd come through. The loading doors on the spur side, the big ones, both of them swinging on their tracks with the low rolling sound of heavy hardware. Hardin killed the lamp, put his back against the office wall beside the plank door, and stood in the dark of the office and listened. Boots on the warehouse floor. More than one pair. Moving slowly, not rushing, which said they'd come prepared for what they'd find, rather than responding to something unexpected. A lamp came on out in the main warehouse, orange light under the office door. Dick Farr's voice said, "I know you're in there." He said it without raising it, directing it at the back of the warehouse. A man who'd done this before, in rooms he'd chosen in advance. "The office is the only place in this building worth going to," Farr said. "The doors got no lock, and your lamp went out about 4 seconds before I opened the loading doors, so you're standing in there in the dark right now deciding what to do about this." The boots moved along the warehouse floor toward the office. Unhurried. "What you should do is come out with both hands clear, so we can have a conversation about what you're looking for and why it's not worth what you're going to spend to get it." Hardin looked at the plank door and threw it in his mind's eye at the warehouse beyond. One lamp, which meant one set of hands carrying it, which meant Dick's and at minimum one other man. The loading doors at the spur end. The personnel door at the street end, which he'd come through, and which opened inward and was 50 feet away, and required him to cross the lit warehouse to reach. He looked up. Freight warehouses in this country built their haylofts on the north wall to keep the hay dry. The shelf above Raphael's desk ran the width of the office, and the north wall above the shelf had a hatch in it, plank construction, a rope loop for a handle. 12 feet up. The lamp on the shelf put it in reach. He didn't stop to examine the full extent of his idea, because the full extent of it had problems he'd rather solve from a height than at floor level with Dick Farr's lamp about to come through the door. He stepped onto the desk chair, onto the desk, got his hands on the shelf and pulled, got a knee up, stood on the shelf with the ledger books clattering against the bricks and his head 6 inches from the ceiling. The plank door swung open below him. Dick Farr came through it with the lamp held high and 2 men at his back, and they looked at the empty office, the dark, the disarranged books, the chair pushed out, the desk disturbed, and the lamp swung across the walls and the floor and the desk, and then Farr looked up. Hardin had the hatch open, and was through it in the same second, pulling it down behind him. And he came up into the loft in a crouch with darkness above and the sound of Dick Farr's boots on the desk below him. The loft ran the width of the building, and held nothing but air and old rope, and the smell of hay that had been gone for a season. No floor hatch on the far end. No window. The loading doors below opened at ground level, not into the loft. He'd known, before he went up, that there was nothing up here except up, and up had no exit. And he'd gone up anyway, because up bought him the 10 seconds he needed to make the only calculation that mattered. Below, Farr's voice from the office, the loft. "North wall hatch," one of the other men said. "I see it." The lamplight came up through the gaps between the office ceiling planks, orange bars shifting as Farr moved. Then boots on wood, the desk, the shelf, and a hand pushing at the hatch from below. The hatch had no latch. Hardin put his knee on it. The hatch pushed up against his knee and held. Below it, Farr leaned into the push, and the hatch gave a half-inch, and Hardin drove his knee down, and it seated. Farr pushed again, harder, and Hardin set his shoulder against the angled roof beam above him, and put his full weight into the knee, and the hatch held. A silence below. Then Farr's voice, close under the hatch, conversational, "That loft has no way out. You know that." Hardin said nothing. He was counting seconds, and listening to the warehouse floor below the loft, because the man who'd named the hatch in the north wall had not been the one to name it, which meant he was down there instead of up here, moving toward the loading doors to come around to the exterior north wall. "You can stay up there," Farr said, "or you can come down and we talk like civilized people. Either way, I've got a man going around outside right now." Hardin looked toward the building's north end in the dark. The roof line, at the north gable, came down to maybe 8 feet above the ground on the exterior. If the north wall had any kind of lean-to structure against it, a wood store, an equipment shed, anything with a lower roof, 8 feet became manageable. If it was straight, adobe wall to bare ground, 8 feet was a broken ankle minimum, and everything that came after a broken ankle in a freight yard in a town that belonged to the man whose men were currently below you. He had no way to know from up here. The hatch pushed again. The loading doors at the spur end of the warehouse opened from the outside. He heard the track hardware, and a third lamp came in, and the light it threw up through the floor gaps was enough to see by if there'd been anything in the loft to see, which there wasn't. Below him, Farr shifted on the shelf, readjusting his leverage. Hardin pressed his ear to the roof planks at the north gable. Outside, boots on packed earth. The man going around the building, unhurried, because he knew there was nowhere to go. Then the sound stopped, and a new sound replaced it. 2 sharp raps on the exterior wall, the knock of a knuckle on adobe. Not a warning. A signal. Ada's signal. 3 nights earlier, she'd told him, 2 knocks meant she was outside and clear. She'd set it in the dry creek bed the morning she left the note, crouched by the cold fire, going over what she'd planned for a situation she'd expected might come. He'd filed it. He pulled the Colt, pointed it at the roof plank above the hatch, and fired twice. The shots punched through the tin roof, and the sound of them in the enclosed space hit like a physical thing, and below him Farr fell off the shelf or jumped, and the lamplight lurched and went sideways, and in the 3 seconds of pure confusion that 2 gunshots in a small enclosed space produce in the men who heard them but didn't expect them, Hardin drove his shoulder into the north gable end where the roof planks met the wall, and the planks were old, and the wall was older, and the joint between them was held together by faith and 10-year-old nails, and the planks gave. He went through the gap feet first, one arm hooked on the roof beam, and dropped. Below him, not bare ground, a wood pile. He came down on the far side of it, and the split logs rolled under his boots, and he went sideways and came down on one knee on the hard earth of the freight yard, and the knee said its opinion about this, and he ignored it, and came up and ran north. Ada stood 10 feet from the north wall with the gray's reins in one hand and the roans in the other, and an expression on her face that held no surprise at all, as though men falling out of warehouse roofs onto woodpiles was something she'd planned for specifically. "There's 3 of them inside," he said. "Breck has the loading door." "Breck." He went around when he heard the shots. She handed him the roan's reins. "Did you get the ledger?" He checked his coat. He'd shoved both books inside when he climbed the desk, and the coat had held them. He pulled one out and held it up. She reached across and took it, and opened it, and held it toward the freight yard lamp that had fallen on its side against the wall, and was still burning, throwing a wedge of light across the gravel. 1883, she said. "Good. That's the one." From inside the warehouse, a shot. Then Breck's voice, carrying clearly through the loading door gap. "Consider your options carefully, gentlemen, because I have all night." The roan turned a circle, and Hardin brought her around, and from the loading door came a sound that took him a moment to place. A man laughing, short and genuine. The sound of someone who has just been told something that struck him as accurate. Dick Farr's voice followed. "Who in hell are you?" "Debt collector," Breck said. "You want my card?" Ada put her boot in the stirrup. "We need to go," she said. "Breck can handle Farr for 2 minutes. After that, Farr is going to decide the ledger is the priority and come out. Breck comes with us." "I know that." She swung up. "That's what the 2 minutes is for." Inside the warehouse, Breck said something else in his low carrying voice, and Hardin couldn't make it out above the sound of the roan's hooves as he mounted, but whatever it was, Farr answered it, and the answer had the tone of a man responding to something that required a response, even though he knew responding was what the other man wanted. Breck had a gift for that. The freight yard had one exit to the south, between the warehouse and the depot platform. Hardin took the roan south through it at a jog with Ada behind him, and they cleared the depot platform and hit the bench road, and he pulled the roan up and looked back. Breck came out of the loading door at a walk, not running, with his coat buttoned and his pipe in his hand, and the expression of a man who has resolved a business meeting to his satisfaction and sees no reason to hurry the aftermath. He found his horse tied to the depot platform post, and untied it and swung up and came south at a trot. "Dick's Farr," Hardin said when he pulled up. "What did you say to him?" "I told him his employer had a federal problem coming, and that men who cooperate early fare considerably better than men who cooperate late." Breck put the pipe between his teeth. "He told me what I could do with that opinion, which is why I'm here and not in there discussing it further." "Is he going to come after us?" "Not tonight," Breck said. "He's going to go to Swick and tell him what happened, and Swick is going to have a very unpleasant evening, and tomorrow morning Swick will make a decision about what to do next." He looked at Ada. "The ledger. I have it. Then we ride." He pointed his horse north. "There's a stage station 12 miles up the river road with a telegraph office. We send a wire to Villanueva tonight, and we do not come back to Perdition." Ada looked south toward the town, toward the rail spur and the warehouse and the lamp still burning in the freight yard. She looked at it long enough that Hardin knew what she was counting. Not the distance, not the danger. What she was leaving behind. The place where her husband's work had lived, the wagons with their tongues up, the office that still smelled of the pen dried out in the tin cup. Then she turned north and put the gray into a canter. Hardin let her go ahead. He sat the roan and looked at Breck. "The stage station telegraph," he said. "Who does the operator report to?" "Territorial line," Breck said. Not local. Swick can't intercept it. You're sure? I wired Villanueva from it last month, Breck said. He gave Hardin a sideways look. Before you ask, yes, I've been working this case for 3 weeks. Latimer's 60 was a reason to be in this territory. The rest of it was already here. Hardin turned the roan north. You found me on purpose. I found you because Latimer sent me, Breck said. I kept you because you're useful. Those are both true. He moved his horse up beside the roan. You want to be angry about it. Do it after we send the wire. The bench road ran north into the dark ahead of them. The river breaks country on either side. Ada's gray, a moving shadow 200 yards up. The stars had come out hard and close, the sky so full of them it looked structural. Hardin rode, and did not say anything because Breck was right. The wire first, the accounting after. And also because he wasn't certain he was angry. He'd been found and used, and it had produced a ledger and a forged document and a gold ring and a letter connecting Swick to a territorial judge, which was considerably more than $11 and a poker debt had any right to produce in 3 days. And Breck had been on the right side of every decision since the boardwalk chair. He'd think about it later. Right now, the stage station was 12 miles north, and the wire needed sending, and whatever Calder Swick decided about tomorrow morning was going to arrive before they were ready for it if they sat in the road talking about it. He put the roan to a canter, and the roan went, and behind him Perdition's lights shrank and then vanished as the bench road dropped into a cut, and the town disappeared as if it had never been there, which was more or less how Hardin preferred his towns. Chapter 4. How fast do you think Far moves? Breck asked it over the sound of his horse's hooves on the packed road, addressing the question to the space between himself and Hardin, rather than to either of them directly. Fast enough, Hardin said. He went to Swick before he went home last night, and Swick spent the night thinking. Then we have until Swick finishes thinking. Which is now, Ada said from ahead of them. She'd been riding point since they left the freight yard, the gray eating up the road at a pace that said she'd agreed to this direction, and intended to arrive before anyone could change the terms. Swick's not a man who thinks overnight. He makes decisions, and executes them, and thinks about whether they were correct later. You sound like you know him, Breck said. I've been watching him for 6 weeks. Breck took that and put it away. The road north ran straight through the breaks country, the river on the east side visible as a darker line in the darkness below the bluffs, the caprock to the west a black wall against a sky gone purple. The stage station sat 12 miles out, and the horses were moving at a rate that would cover it in an hour if the road held. Hardin turned the roan once to look back south. Perdition's lights made a small cluster at the edge of visibility, and as he watched, one cluster of lights moved, not a building burning, not a lantern swinging. Riders. 3, maybe 4, coming out of the south end of town at a pace that said they knew the direction and weren't guessing at it. They're already out, he said. Ada pulled the gray around without instruction, and saw what he saw and turned back north. How far back? Mile. Less. The station is 11 miles, Breck said. He'd done the arithmetic before Hardin finished the sentence. Those horses are fresh. Ours aren't. No. So we don't make the station ahead of them. Not on this road. Hardin looked at the bluffs to the west. The caprock ran continuous here, the face too steep for horses, but a quarter mile ahead the bench road angled toward a cut he'd clocked riding south the day before. A dry drainage that came down through the caprock face. He'd seen it as an exit then. Now it was the same thing. The cut in the caprock. Quarter mile. I know the one, Ada said. She'd ridden this road before him, and longer than him, and knew every feature of it. It goes up to the bench top. 2 miles of bad ground up there, and then the Mesa Road. The Mesa Road goes to the station. Adds 3 miles. 3 miles on a road those riders don't know, versus a mile on one they do, Breck said. He'd stopped sounding like he was calculating, and started sounding like he'd arrived at a number. Take the cut. They took it. The drainage was everything a dry creek bed at midnight asked a horse to be. Loose shale, sudden drops, the kind of footing that punishes a horse that's rushing and rewards one that's thinking. The roan fought her way up it with her ears pinned and her neck low, placing each hoof with the deliberate care of an animal that had been asked to do hard things before and had developed opinions about how to survive them. Hardin gave her her head and stayed out of her way. Behind him, Breck's horse scrabbled on a loose section and recovered. Breck said something short under his breath that Hardin chose not to request clarification on. Ada's gray went up the cut like it had been doing this since birth, which was the kind of thing a woman bought when she came to rough country with a plan. They crested the bench top in 15 minutes, and the ground changed under them. Short grass and limestone shelf, the open sky enormous above them, the river country below and behind them to the east. No sign of pursuit on the drainage behind them. The riders from Perdition had stayed on the road, which was either because they'd lost the trail in the dark or because they knew about the Mesa Road and were going around. They know about the Mesa Road, Ada said. Probably, Breck agreed. Then we're not ahead of them. We're just on a different road that arrives at the same place, with 3 miles more to cover. Hardin looked north along the bench top. The Mesa Road ran as a faint double track through the grass, visible where the limestone showed through. How good is the station man? Breck considered this in the way he considered most things, briefly and without apparent effort. Old. Cautious. He'll send the wire if I ask him to, and he'll do it before anyone else asks him not to, because he's been running that station for 11 years and he values his neutrality. Will he value it at 2 in the morning, with 4 of Swick's men in the yard? That's a better question. They rode. The bench top ran flat, and the horses settled into a road trot that ate ground without destroying them, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the wind off the mesa came in from the northwest and smelled of juniper and nothing else, which was the smell of country that had no people in it, which was a smell Hardin had always found clarifying. Ada came back alongside him. If we don't make the station before they do, what then? We make the station before they do. And if we don't? He looked at her profile in the starlight. She asked it as a practical question, not a frightened one. She wanted the contingency the same way she'd wanted the 2-knock signal and the key to the back door, because she believed in having alternatives arranged in advance. Then we negotiate, he said. With Swick's men. With whoever shows up. Breck, she said, moving her voice back to include him. You told Farr he had a federal problem coming. Did he believe you? He believed me enough to stop and think about it, Breck said. Whether he's still thinking, or whether Swick told him to stop thinking and start riding, is the variable. If Farr is with those riders, he'll be the one worth talking to, Breck said. Swick's other men do what they're told. Farr does what makes sense. You're betting he's made a calculation, Hardin said. I'm betting he's a professional, Breck said. Which is a better bet than most. The stage station sat in a hollow where the Mesa Road dropped back down to river level. A cluster of low adobe buildings around a central yard, the main building with its telegraph office, a stable, a cookhouse, and a water trough fed by a windmill that turned in the northwest wind with a sound like a man idly drumming his fingers. Lamplight in the main building's window. The station man, whoever he was, kept late hours or slept light. They came down the Mesa Road at a walk, letting the horses breathe, and Hardin counted the yard from 200 yards out. No riders in the yard. No horses at the rail that he could see at this distance. Either Swick's men had not arrived, had taken a different route, or had arrived and gone inside, and the first option was the one he liked. Ada stopped her gray at the yard gate. One horse at the stable rail. He saw it, a sorrel tied neat, saddle still on. A single rider who'd arrived before them. Station rider, Breck said. Maybe a traveler. At this hour, Hardin said, with a saddle still on. They sat and let the yard show them what it would. The windmill turned. The lamplight held steady in the window. The sorrel stood with one hip dropped, not newly arrived. She'd been there long enough to relax, which meant 40 minutes minimum. I'll go in, Hardin said. Alone. Ada made it a statement. You and Breck stay with the horses. If I'm not out in 10 minutes, or if more riders come up the road, go back up the mesa, and don't come back down. And you? I'll find my own way out. He stepped down from the roan and handed Ada the reins. Keep her quiet. She has opinions about standing in the dark. Don't we all? Breck murmured. Hardin crossed the yard at a normal pace, no hurry, the Colt in its holster and his hands loose. The main building's door stood ajar, light coming through the gap, and he pushed it open with 2 fingers and went in. A single room, a counter along the back wall with the telegraph equipment on a shelf above it, a desk, 3 chairs, a potbelly stove banked for the night. An old man behind the counter, with a face like worked leather and white hair gone to yellow at the temples, in shirt sleeves and suspenders, a pen in his hand and a ledger open in front of him. He looked up at Hardin without alarm. A man who ran a stage station for 11 years had seen enough midnight visitors to stop being surprised by them. In one of the 3 chairs, a man Hardin had not seen before sat with his hat on his knee and a cup of coffee in his hand. 35, lean, dark vest over a gray shirt, a deputy's badge on the vest that was not Perdition's badge, different shape federal star. The man with the badge looked at Hardin. Hardin. Depends who's asking. Cord Villanueva. He set the coffee cup on the floor beside the chair. United States Deputy Marshal, Las Vegas office. I've been sitting here for 2 hours waiting for either you or a wire from Breck. Breck's faster with a horse than a telegraph, apparently. Hardin looked at him. Then he looked at the station man. The station man offered nothing except the pen in his hand and the expression of a man who valued his neutrality. You're early, Hardin said to Villanueva. Breck wired me 3 weeks ago when he figured out who you were and where you were going. Villanueva reached into his vest and produced a folded paper. He sent a preliminary report on the Swick operation. I've been in this territory for 10 days building what I needed to move. What I was missing was a direct link between Swick and Morrow. He held the paper up. I'm told you might have one. The woman has it. Then get the woman. Ada sat across the station desk from Villanueva for 40 minutes and laid it out. The original loan note and the altered version. The letter to Morrow with its language about resolution, north of the Canadian, the ring, the court records she'd carried from home, the correspondence from 3 other operators who'd lost businesses to identical mechanisms. Raphael's ledger. She set each document on the desk in the order she'd arranged them months ago, in the sequence that built the argument from foundation to roof. Villanueva read without interrupting. He was a thorough reader, not a fast one, and he gave each document the attention it had earned. Breck sat against the wall with his arms crossed and his hat tipped back and watched the ceiling. Hardin stood at the window, watching the yard. Nothing came up the road. The letter, Villanueva said. He held it under the desk lamp. Swick's handwriting. Addressed tomorrow by name. A reference to a resolution north of the Canadian. He set it down. This isn't a conviction, but it's enough to arrest on, and enough to take to a federal grand jury. Morrow, Ada said. Morrow is mine on a separate track. I've had 2 territorial court clerks willing to testify about dismissed complaints for 14 months. This letter puts Swick's name on it directly. He stacked the documents and squared the edges. The fraud case on the loan instruments is clean. The altered interest rate, the forged collateral clause, the backdated signature. That's federal bank fraud if Swick used the territorial banking system, which he did. The estate recovery, Ada said. The freight operation. If the loan is fraudulent, the seizure is void under territorial statute. Your property reverts. He looked at her steadily. Those are 2 different proceedings. The criminal case moves first. The civil recovery follows it. How long? The arrest happens this week. The criminal trial, he spread his hands. Months. Federal courts don't move fast. But the seizure order gets stayed the moment I file the fraud complaint, which means Swick stops profiting from the freight operation while the case runs. Ada looked at the ring on the desk in front of her. She'd set it beside the documents as she laid them out, and it had sat there through the whole conversation. Raphael, she said. The resolution language in the letter gives me grounds to open a separate investigation into his disappearance, Villanueva said. He said it carefully. I can't tell you what that investigation finds. I can tell you I will run it. She picked up the ring and put it in her pocket. All right. Breck, Villanueva said without looking at him. You're going to earn your introduction to Latimer. I assumed so, Breck said to the ceiling. They were still at the station at 4 in the morning when the riders came up the road. Not from the south, from the east, off the river track, 4 of them, and Hardin saw their lamps from the window a quarter-mile out and stepped back from the glass. 4, he said. Villanueva was on his feet before Hardin finished the word, which said something about the man's reflexes. Stay inside. Let me handle the yard. They're Swick's, Hardin said. I know whose they are. He buckled his gun belt, which he'd removed, and draped on the chair back in the way of a man who'd expected a long sit. I have a federal warrant for Calder Swick's arrest on fraud charges that I signed 3 days ago. I've been waiting for the documentation to file it. He picked up his hat. Now I have the documentation. Breck lowered his chair's front legs to the floor. He's going to try to arrest Swick's men in the yard at 4 in the morning, he said to no one. Not Swick's men, Villanueva said from the doorway. I don't have warrants on the men yet. I'm going to identify them and inform them that Swick is being charged federally and that anything they do in his service tonight gets added to that charge sheet. He looked at Hardin. Is Farr with them? Hardin went back to the window. The lamps were close enough now to resolve into riders. He counted faces and found the one he'd been looking for. Compact, still in the saddle, positioned at the back of the 4. Yes. Good. Villanueva went out. Hardin watched through the window. The riders came into the yard, and Villanueva met them at the gate, his badge catching the lamplight, his voice carrying back to the window in tone, if not in words. He held up the warrant document with one hand and kept the other hand easy at his side, and the 4 riders pulled up, and the one in front, a big man Hardin recognized as the one who'd come through the warehouse loading doors, leaned down from his horse to read the paper. Farr stayed at the back and watched. The big man said something, and Villanueva responded, and the big man looked at the other 2 riders and then back at Villanueva. and the conversation ran back and forth a few more times with the particular quality of an argument that one side has already won and the other side is taking its time accepting. Then Farr rode to the front. He said something to the big man. The big man said something back. Farr said something short and final, and the big man pulled his horse aside, and Farr came up to Villanueva, and they talked for 2 minutes while the other 3 riders sat their horses and had their own conversation in an undertone, and the windmill turned overhead. Farr nodded once. He turned his horse south, and the other 3 followed him, and Villanueva came back inside with his hat in his hand and a look on his face of a man who has spent patience and gotten value for it. Farr, Hardin said. Farr, Villanueva confirmed. He'll testify to Swick's operation in exchange for immunity on the table work and anything connected to it. He says the table was always framing, never a straight cheating operation, and he was told the men he fingered were held and released rather than, he stopped. Regardless, he knew enough of what Swick was doing to qualify as a cooperating witness, and he's smart enough to know that cooperating now beats being indicted later. Breck told him that this afternoon, Hardin said. I know. Farr said to tell Breck he wants a receipt. Breck made a sound that might have been a laugh. Ada stood by the desk with the station man's lamp turned up and the ledger open to the 1883 accounts. She'd been reading it while the yard played out, running her finger down columns of figures with the focused attention of someone who knows the handwriting and is glad to see it. She didn't look up. When do you arrest him? This morning, Villanueva said. I ride back to town. I present the warrant to whoever's serving as proper law in Perdition, which given the deputy's situation appears to be no one at the moment, and I arrest Calder Swick at his place of business. The Comstock, Hardin said. At sunrise. Villanueva looked at him. You can come if you want. You have standing as a witness. What kind of man is Swick? The kind who's never had anyone walk through his door with legal authority he couldn't manage. Villanueva picked up his coffee cup from the floor, found it cold, set it on the desk. Those men are the hardest ones to arrest. They've been running the room so long, they believe they always will. Will he be armed? He will. Hardin thought about that, and about what Villanueva had said, and about what Ada had said 3 days and several lifetimes ago. Swick makes decisions and executes them, and thinks about whether they were correct later. A man like that, handed a warrant at sunrise in a room he owns, might make a decision before he had time to think about whether it was correct. I'll come, he said. They rode south, as the sky ahead of them went from black to the first uncertain gray, the breaking country below the bench rolling out to the east in long shadows. Villanueva set the pace, and it was a lawman's pace, steady, covering ground without burning the horses, with the unhurried confidence of a man carrying a warrant that had not yet expired. Breck rode alongside Hardin. For what it's worth, he said, the thing with Latimer. You mean finding me on purpose? I had a lead on Swick's operation and no inside angle. Breck nodded at the road ahead. Latimer had a debt that put me in this territory legitimately. I put the two together. Did Latimer know? No. Latimer knows he sent me to collect $60 from a man who owed it. As far as Latimer's concerned, that's the whole of it. And the 60. Breck turned in the saddle to look at him with an expression that communicated he was about to say something he'd been saving. The El Paso introduction. Write me a letter to your man there. I'll take that in place of the 60 and call Latimer even. Hardin looked at him. You know about the El Paso connection. I know about several of your connections, Breck said. Collecting debts professionally requires knowing a great deal about the people you collect from. It's not personal. It feels personal. Most things do. Breck straightened in the saddle. Write me the letter, and we're square. Your man in El Paso runs legitimate freight brokerage and needs a reliable contact in the Las Vegas market. I can be that contact. Everyone profits. He's a debt broker, Hardin said. Not a freight broker. I know what he is, Breck said pleasantly. Write me the letter. Ada had been riding ahead of them and had apparently heard enough of it. Without turning, write him the letter, Hardin. He earned it. Hardin rode with the gray pre-dawn coming up around them, and the roan eating the distance to Perdition stride by steady stride, and he thought about debts and the different shapes they came in, and whether writing the letter was paying one or creating another. He'd write it. Perdition at sunrise had the raw, unsettled quality of a town that had been up all night arguing with itself. 2 horses at the Comstock's rail, saddled. The deputy's office dark, door closed, which meant Deputy Poole had made a decision about his badge in the small hours, and the decision had involved going home. The main street was empty, except for a dog that crossed it without apparent purpose, and a boy of 12 who stood at the depot end watching the 4 of them ride in with the alert attention of someone who had been told something interesting was about to happen. Villanueva pulled up at the Comstock's rail and stepped down and tied his horse with the economical movements of a man not performing anything for an audience. He straightened his badge, squared his hat, and looked at the closed door. Breck, he said. Stay with the horses. Happily, Breck said. Miss Reyes. Same. Ada looked at the Comstock door, and at Villanueva, and at Hardin, and she made a calculation that showed in her face for the half-second before she controlled it. She wanted to go in. 8 months of watching and waiting and planning, and the door was 20 feet away. She wanted to go through it. Miss Reyes, Villanueva said again, with the tone of a man who means it the second time. All right. She stayed with the horses. Villanueva went to the door, and Hardin went with him, and Villanueva pushed it open without knocking, which was the right call. A man with a warrant does not knock. The Comstock in the morning hour ran on a skeleton crew, a barman wiping glasses behind the counter, 1 man at a table with coffee and a newspaper, and at the back of the room, at the table where Dix Farr had run his poker game 2 nights ago, Calder Swick. He was not what Hardin had constructed in his mind over 3 days of moving through the edges of the man's operation. He'd expected someone built to match the scope of what he ran. Physically large, theatrically commanding, the kind of presence that made a room rearrange itself. Calder Swick was 60 and thin, and dressed in a town suit of dark wool, and he sat at the poker table with coffee and account books and the air of a man conducting an ordinary Tuesday morning. He looked up when they came in. His eyes moved from Villanueva's badge to Hardin's face and back to the badge, and a calculation ran across his expression with the speed of a man who had been making calculations in rooms like this for 30 years and had learned to make them fast. Mr. Swick, Villanueva said. He crossed the room and laid the warrant on the table beside the account books. Calder Swick, you're under arrest on federal charges of bank fraud, document fraud, and conspiracy. I'm going to need you to stand up. Swick read the warrant without touching it. He read it the way he probably read everything, thoroughly without expression, extracting what he needed. Then he looked at Hardin with the dispassionate interest of a man identifying a piece in a puzzle he'd mostly solved, but not quite. You're the one who was at the poker table, Swick said. Yes. Dix told me you were good. He doesn't say that often. He looked at the warrant again. Grant Morrow. He said the judge's name in a flat voice that was neither a question nor a confirmation. Is he arrested, too? His warrant is being served in Santa Fe this morning, Villanueva said. Stand up, Mr. Swick. Swick stood. He did it with the ease of a man accustomed to deciding when to stand, and finding that this particular time was fine with him. He left the account books open on the table, and his coffee half full. He looked at Hardin once more, as Villanueva put the cuffs on, and what his expression held was not anger, and not defeat, and not the specific resentment of a man caught, but something Hardin had seen only a few times before on the faces of men who had run operations of scale, the look of a man computing the distance between where he is and where he expected to be, and finding the number unexpectedly large. The woman, Swick said. Mrs. Reyes. What about her? Hardin said. She's outside, I assume. It was not quite a question. Yes. Swick nodded once, accepting this as a data point. Tell her she ran a tighter operation than I gave her credit for. The 6 weeks she was watching me, I knew she was there. I didn't know what she'd built. Hardin looked at him. Tell her yourself. Mr. Swick, Villanueva said. He walked out with Villanueva's hand on his arm, and his hands in the cuffs and his suit jacket buttoned. The barman put down his glass. The man at the table with the newspaper did not look up, which said he'd known this was coming, and had decided the newspaper was safer than eye contact. Hardin followed them to the door, pushed it open. Outside on the main street of Perdition, Ada Reyes stood at the rail with Breck and the horses, and when Swick came through the door, she looked at him with a face that gave him nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief, not the vindication she'd earned across 8 months of careful work. She looked at him the same way she'd looked at Dick's Farr across the poker table, counting something, arriving at a number, filing it. Swick met her eyes. He nodded once, a small motion, a man acknowledging the quality of work he'd been on the wrong side of. Ada said nothing. Villanueva put Swick on his horse, and tied his cuffed hands to the saddle horn, which was not comfortable and was not meant to be, and mounted his own horse and looked at Hardin. Trial testimony, he said. Both of you. I'll need statements before you leave the territory. Today, Hardin said. Today. The boy at the depot end of the street had been joined by 3 others, and they stood in a row watching Swick on horseback with his hands tied. And one of them said something to the others, and 2 of them laughed, and Swick heard it, and his jaw tightened once and then let go. Hardin, Breck said. He held out a hand. In it, a folded piece of paper. For the letter to El Paso. I took the liberty. Hardin unfolded it. Breck had written out the text of the introduction in a clean professional hand, accurate in every detail about the El Paso man's name and business and what Breck could offer him. He'd left a line at the bottom for Hardin's signature. You were confident, Hardin said. I was prepared, Breck said. Those are different things. Hardin looked at the letter. He looked at the roan, who had found an angle of the morning sun that suited her and had closed her eyes in it. He looked at Ada beside the gray, her hand on the ledger book she'd carried since the freight yard, the ring in her pocket. 8 months of planning come down to a Tuesday morning on the main street of Perdition with Calder Swick on a horse and his hands tied. He signed the letter. Breck took it, folded it, put it in his vest pocket and buttoned the pocket. Pleasure, he said. Breck. He stopped. The 60, Hardin said. We never actually settled it. Breck reached into his coat, produced a small notebook, opened it, made a mark with a pencil stub, closed it, put it away. Latimer is going to tell you the debt's retired, he said. Because I'm going to tell him it's retired. And because the El Paso introduction is worth 4 times 60 to both of us if your man there is as useful as I think he is. He buttoned his coat. But I appreciate you asking. Most people don't. He rode south without looking back. Villanueva and Swick were already moving. Ada had not moved. She stood at the gray's shoulder with one hand on the animal's neck and her eyes on the Comstock's closed door, and the expression of a woman doing a kind of accounting that had nothing to do with freight manifests or loan notes or federal warrants. Hardin brought the roan alongside and stopped. "You want to go inside," he said. "I ran the freight operation from that office for 2 years," she said. "When Raphael was on the road. I did the billing, the manifests, the client correspondence." She took her hand off the gray's neck. "The Comstock's back office. That was my office before it was Swick's." He sat the roan and said nothing. "The account books he left on the table," she said. "I'd like them." He stepped down, went to the Comstock door, pushed it open. The barman looked at him from behind the counter, and Hardin looked back, and the barman found somewhere else to look. He crossed to the back table and picked up the account books, 2 of them, green leather, the kind that office supply companies sold by the case in every territorial city, and carried them outside. Ada took them. She ran her thumb along the spine of the top one, checking the binding, the way you check a thing you intend to keep. "Still our books," Hardin said. "Raphael's handwriting," she said. "Up until 8 months ago. After that, someone else's. But the first entries are his." She put them in her saddlebag. "Now I need to give a statement to a federal marshal and find a lawyer who can file the civil recovery on the freight operation and locate the 3 clients whose contracts Swick took." She swung up onto the gray with the straightforward efficiency of a woman who has moved from one thing to the next and intends to keep moving. "Are you staying?" "For the statements." "After." He thought about Decker Foy, somewhere south of Fort Stockton on an 18-month cold trail that had nothing to do with Perdition, New Mexico. He thought about the roan's opinion of standing in the dark, which he shared. He thought about the letter he'd just signed and what it connected him to, and whether that was better or worse than what he'd been connected to before he rode over the ridge above this town. "For the statements," he said again. She accepted this for what it was, which was an honest answer that covered the immediate question, and left the rest of it where it belonged, which was in front of him rather than behind him where the road went. The roan opened both eyes. She'd found the angle of sun she wanted, and she'd gotten it, and now she seemed prepared to go wherever the next thing was. "Let's give the statements," Hardin said. "Then we'll see." Chapter 5. Sign at the bottom, and initial the 4th paragraph where I've marked it. Villanueva slid the statement across the desk with a pen on top of it, and Hardin signed where he was told without reading the 4th paragraph, because he'd told Villanueva everything in it an hour ago and trusted the man's version as much as his own. Ada's statement took 40 minutes. Hers went back further. 8 months of documented observation, the names of the other freight operators who'd lost businesses to the same mechanism, the specific dates when each dismissed complaint had come back from Morrow's court. Villanueva wrote in a small, careful hand and asked clarifying questions and did not waste words or ask the same thing twice. And Hardin sat in the corner of the hotel dining room with coffee that had gotten cold and watched Ada work through it with the same precision she'd brought to everything else, the ring in her pocket and the account books on the chair beside her. The red-faced woman refilled Hardin's cup without being asked. She'd been doing that all morning with the equanimity of someone who had seen federal marshals in her dining room before and expected to see them again, and found neither occurrence worth remarking on. When Ada finished, Villanueva squared the pages and put them in a leather case and buckled it. "The civil recovery filing," he said. "A lawyer named Teague, in Las Vegas, handles federal adjacent property cases. He's competent, and he's not connected to Morrow's network. I'll send him a letter today." "Today," Ada said. "Not a question. Confirmation." "Today. The criminal arraignment happens in Santa Fe within the week. The fraud complaint goes to the territorial court simultaneously, which triggers the seizure stay." He closed the case. "Swick stops drawing income from your operation the moment that stay is filed. Teague can get it filed before the arraignment." "How long before I get it back?" "Teague will tell you 6 months. It'll be 9. Villanueva picked up his hat. "That's the honest answer." "I appreciate honest answers." He nodded once in a way that said he'd noticed that about her, and found it professionally useful. Then he looked at Hardin. "You riding south?" "North," Hardin said. "There's nothing north of here worth riding toward." "There's nothing south worth riding toward either," Hardin said. "South is where I came from." Villanueva put on his hat and picked up the case. At the dining room door, he stopped. "Rafael Reyes," he said. He said it to the doorframe rather than to either of them, the way a man brings up a subject he's been carrying for a while and hasn't found the right footing for. "The investigation north of the Canadian. I have 2 deputies who know that country. They'll go in within the week." Ada kept her hands flat on the table in front of her. "And when they find something?" "You'll hear from me directly. Not from a deputy, and not in a letter." She pressed her palms down once, a small deliberate motion, then lifted them. "Thank you, Marshal." He went out. The morning ran to noon, and the town of Perdition did what towns do after the marshal leaves with the man who owned them. It exhaled. Not loudly. The Comstock opened its doors with a new man behind the bar, one of the regulars, who decided the job needed doing and nobody else was going to do it. Deputy Poole materialized mid-morning with his badge back on, and a manner suggesting he'd been unavoidably detained and expected everyone to accept this, and most people appeared willing to go along with it because the alternative was a deputy-shaped vacancy during a period when vacancies were already plentiful. Obi came and found Hardin at the livery. He came around the stall door with his hat in his hand, and his face wearing the expression it had carried at the poker table when he'd made a bet he knew was too big and couldn't see a clean way out of it. "I wanted to say something," he said. "Say it." "The night you were at the table, when I told you to do what you came for by morning." He turned the hat. "I knew what Farr was going to do. I'd seen it 4 other times. Men came in, played well, got the charge and the deputy. You didn't do anything about those 4 times." "No." Hardin ran a brush down the roan's shoulder, and she leaned into it the way she leaned into things she decided were worth accepting. "Hard county to live in and do something about," he said. "That's what I told myself." Obi was quiet for a moment. "Still is, probably." "It's different now than it was yesterday." "Yes." Obi put his hat back on. "I just wanted to say it. Out loud, to somebody." He turned for the stall door and stopped. "For what it's worth, you didn't cheat. Dix Farr doesn't care about that. He just needed a civic matter." "I know," Hardin said. "I know you know. I needed to say it anyway." He left. Hardin went back to the brush, and the roan shifted and sighed in the way of a horse that has been adequately attended to and is communicating a readiness for whatever comes next. Ada found him at the freight warehouse at 2 in the afternoon. She'd come through the loading doors with the ledger under her arm and a different quality of posture than she'd had in 3 days of watching him move through her plan. Less coiled, more grounded, as if some central tension had been released and the remaining structure was proving sound. She walked the length of the building without stopping, past the wagons with their tongues up, past the harness on its hooks, past the mule collar nobody had repaired, and into the back office. Hardin followed. The office held everything it had held the night before, except Dick's Farr's lamp. The pen in the tin cup still dry. The route maps still pinned to the wall. The shelf above the desk with its gap where 2 ledger books had been. Ada set the ledger on the shelf in the gap and stepped back. She stood there looking at it for a moment, in the way you look at a thing you've been trying to get back to its right place for a long time, and are now deciding whether it looks right or whether the place has changed enough that right is somewhere different now. 23 accounts receivable in that book, she said. 13 of them are businesses that Swick took over in the last 18 months. Those clients are paying their freight fees to Swick's operation right now. Not for long. Not for long, she agreed. But there's a gap between when the seizure stay is filed and when the court rules, and when I have drivers and a mule string and working wagons again. 6 months minimum, Villanueva said. 9 probably. The 10 accounts that weren't taken, Hardin said. Those clients still owe the freight fees from before the seizure. Yes. And they've had 8 months to move their shipping to someone else or let the goods sit. She took the ledger back off the shelf and opened it to the last full page of entries. 6 of them are mines. Mines don't stop producing because their freight operator disappears. They find another way. And the other 4. 2 are dry goods stores. 1 is a hotel in Tucumcari. She ran her finger down the column. The 4th is a cattle operation east of Santa Rosa. They were shipping hides to Albuquerque on Raphael's wagons twice a month. Regular as a clock. You know the owner? Raphael did. I've met him twice. She closed the ledger. He's the kind of man who values a relationship over a price. If I go to him with the situation explained and an offer to resume the route at a fair rate, he'll come back. That's 1 account. 1 account pays for a driver and a wagon, she said. And 1 account brings 2 more, because in the freight business the clients talk to each other. Hardin turned this over. She'd been building this in her head for months alongside everything else. The documents, the plan, the 6 weeks of watching, and the business reconstruction had been running in parallel with the legal case the whole time. The ring in her pocket and the route east of Santa Rosa, both present and accounted for. You're going to be all right, he said. She looked at him with the expression she'd worn at the poker table and on the cattle pen fence and in the creek bed above Perdition at midnight, the flat assessment, the inventory, the arriving at a number. Yes, she said. I am. She put the ledger back on the shelf, this time leaving it. That's not the same as saying it's going to be easy. No. But I've been running hard country since before Raphael and I met. This is just more of it. At 4 o'clock, she brought him an envelope with $120 in it. In the hotel dining room, over coffee that was better than any he'd had all week, because the red-faced woman had apparently decided the situation called for her best pot. The agreed amount, Ada said. You don't owe me the full amount. The job changed shape. The job got done. She set the envelope on the table and kept 2 fingers on it. You came back to town for a poker game and ended up with a dead man's ring in your boot. I came back for the lockbox, Hardin said. She studied him with that inventory expression. You came back, she said, and left it there without weight on either side, just the fact of it, which was its own kind of accounting. He took the envelope. She refilled her own coffee from the pot the red-faced woman had left on the table. Where north? No particular destination. There's a man I was behind when I rode into Perdition. He went south when I went into the Comstock game, and he's had 3 days to get further south. I'll pick up the trail and see where it runs. A wanted man. Federal warrant. Murder. That's a different kind of work than what you did here. It's all the same work, he said. You go where the problem is. You figure out the shape of it. You do what the shape requires. She drank her coffee and considered this. You make it sound like a trade. It is a trade. What does it pay? He put the envelope in his vest pocket. Today it paid $120. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something adjacent to it, the expression of a woman who has done a hard thing successfully and has arrived at a place where things that are not hard can get a brief reception. It suited her face better than anything else he'd seen on it in 4 days, and it lasted about as long as it deserved to before she put it away and went back to the coffee. Villanueva's deputies, she said. The ones going north of the Canadian. Yes. Breck said the Canadian breaks are bad country for finding men who don't want to be found. He meant it both ways. I know what he meant. She set the cup down. Outside the dining room window, the main street of Perdition moved with its ordinary afternoon business. A wagon at the feed store, 2 women at the dressmaker's, the boy from the depot end of town, trotting past with something in his arms that required both of them. The Comstock's doors were open, and somebody had already gotten the piano going, which suggested the town had made its peace with the past week and intended to carry on. You're thinking about what Villanueva will find, Hardin said. I'm thinking about what I'll do with whatever it is, she said. Those are different things. That's true. I have enough to do either way. The operation, the legal case, the accounts receivable. She picked the cup back up. Grief or relief, the work is the same. Yes. That's either very sad or very useful, depending on the day. Today. She considered the question the way she considered every question, fully without rushing it. Useful, she said. He saddled the roan at 5 o'clock in the long October light that came in under the livery roof and turned the straw gold and the roan's coat the color of polished rust. She stood for the process with the dignified tolerance of a horse that had made peace with departure as a recurring condition of her employment and saw no productive reason to object to it. The saddlebags went on first, lighter than they'd been 3 days ago because he'd eaten through most of what was in them and replaced it with better supplies from the dry goods store. Hard bread, dried beef, a tin of coffee, a box of cartridges for the Winchester. The Winchester went into the scabbard. The Colt sat where it always sat. The envelope with the $120 went in the inside pocket of his coat, where it joined the folded statement from Villanueva, and Ada's original note with Raphael's birthdate on it, which he'd kept without examining why. He led the roan out of the livery into the street. The town lay around him in the afternoon light with the particular clarity that comes after a thing has been resolved, and the air has stopped holding what it was holding. 2 men at the Comstock's hitching rail. The red-faced woman beating a rug outside the hotel. The depot at the east end of the street with its green roof and its telegraph wire running off into the country toward Santa Fe, toward Las Vegas, toward wherever the wires went. Ada stood at the corner of the hotel. She changed back into the traveling dress, the dark tobacco one, the hat pinned at its angle above the dark hair. The gray was at the rail behind her with a pair of saddlebags and a bedroll, and the look of a horse pointed somewhere specific. Santa Rosa, Ada said before he could ask. The cattle operation. Rancher named Fuentes. I'm going to make a case for resuming the hide route. Today. The civil recovery filing won't move faster because I watch it. He granted this. The gray looked at the roan with the mild professional interest of horses that have traveled together and reached no particular conclusions about each other. Teague in Las Vegas, he said. Breck left me a letter of introduction before he rode out this morning. She said it without irony, which was the right register for it. He would. The October afternoon lay across the main street of Perdition in long amber bars, and the piano in the Comstock threw its tuneless music out through the open doors, and nobody inside it appeared to be bothered by the tuning. Down at the depot, a freight crew had arrived and was moving crates off a flat car with the steady impersonal labor of men who shipped goods for a living and had no investment in what the goods were or where they went. Villanueva said 9 months, Ada said. For the civil recovery. He said 6 and then said 9. I heard both numbers. She took the gray's reins from the rail. I believe the 9. 9 months of building the route back gives me something to do while the court moves. She mounted with the efficiency he'd watched all week. No wasted motion, foot in the stirrup, up and settled in one sequence. It's better to be working than waiting. It always is. She gathered the reins, and the gray moved a step and she held it. She looked at him from the height of the saddle, with the last of the afternoon light behind her, and the assessment in her eyes that had been there since the poker table, since the cattle pen fence, since the creek bed above Perdition when she'd left him a note and 2 numbers and ridden off in the dark. Will you come back through this country? She said. He thought about the man he'd been following before Perdition interrupted him. The direction that man was running, the territory it covered, the possibility that the trail bent back north through New Mexico at some point. Route of travel in this country was never fixed. It depended on what the work required. Maybe, he said. Depends on where the trail goes. That's an honest answer. I know. She held his eye for 2 seconds, then turned the gray east toward Santa Rosa and put her heels to it and went. And she did not look back, which he'd expected. Ada Reyes had not looked back at anything in 4 days, and he saw no reason she'd start now. He watched the gray carry her down the main street, and around the corner at the depot, and out of view. The freight crew at the flat car went on moving crates. The piano went on playing whatever it was playing. The roan turned her head and regarded the space where the gray had been with the brief philosophical interest of a horse considering an absence, and then she turned forward again. He rode north out of Perdition, on the bench road at 5:30 with the sun going down behind the caprock, and the shadows running long across the grama grass, and the Pecos Breaks country opened ahead of him enormous, and unhurried in the way it had been enormous, and unhurried since before anyone put a name to any part of it. The roan settled into a road trot, and he let her set the pace. She had opinions about evening travel, and most of them were sound. He thought about the man he'd been tracking before Perdition. 3 days south, now 4, the trail colder than when he'd lost it but not gone. Trails didn't go gone in this country. They went cold. And cold was a condition you could work with if you had patience and knew how to read ground. He had both. He thought about the note with Raphael's birth date in his coat pocket and did not examine too carefully why he'd kept it. He thought about Breck on the southbound stage, the letter to El Paso in his vest pocket, moving toward the next arrangement with the serene confidence of a man who had never in his professional life failed to find an arrangement that suited him. He'd send the note to the El Paso man tonight from the stage station. The man would get the letter and get the introduction and find Breck professionally useful and something would come of it that none of the three of them could predict yet, which was how useful things worked. The bench road curved west, and the town of Perdition dropped behind the caprock and disappeared. 4 days ago, he'd ridden over a ridge above a town he'd never heard of, with $11 and a $60 debt and a roan horse that had opinions about everything. He had $151 now, no debt, and the same roan horse with the same opinions. The country on either side of the road had not changed. The sky above it had not changed. The wind coming off the Llano had the same cold teeth it had carried on the way in. The arithmetic was about right. The roan trotted north through the long light, and the last of it went orange on the caprock rim, and then red, and then the color that has no name, the brief color between red and dark that lasts about 30 seconds in this country before the sky commits to night. Hardin had been watching that color come and go for 31 years, at the end of days that had run well, and days that had run badly, and days that had run sideways, and he still could not tell, when it arrived, which kind of day it was going to turn out to have been. 3 or 4 miles north, a hawk cut across the last of the light. It banked east and disappeared into the shadow of the bluffs without any apparent concern about what lay on the other side. He rode out of Perdition County the same way he'd ridden in, with one problem settled and another man still ahead of him. That was the work. He didn't figure it would ever stop being the work. The end.